This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, PreSonus, API Audio, Isotope, Sound Porter Mastering, JZ Microphones, and Spectra 1964. And you're hearing my voice right now on the JZ BB29 microphone through the Spectra 1964 STX100 mic pre, C610 comp limiter, and Isotope RX and Ozone. So get ready to rock.
Their manager called me and said, I want you to come up and hear a band and tell me I'm crazy. So I went up and I went to Uncle Charlie's up in Marin County and saw Huey Lewis on American Express. I heard them and went back and talked to him afterwards and went back to the hotel and came home. Manager called me and said, what do you think? I said, the band is good. The songs need work, but that kid is a star.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. I've got two words for you that will help you make your best record ever and not lose it. Storage and backup. You want fast drives for composing and recording and reliable drives for backup so you don't lose all your hard work when something goes wrong. That's why I chose OWC Mercury Extreme Pro 6G internal SSDs for my studio computer and Mercury Elite Pro external drives for archiving. Discover the best OWC drive options for your studio at macsales.com/rockstars. The Spectra 1964 STX100 mic pre provides unequaled headroom and linear output regardless of transient audio peaks, capturing critical details from your microphone. The 100 series amplifiers were used by Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, and the Record Plant on records by ZZ Top, Aerosmith, and John Lennon. Now you can get that same incredible sound in your studio at Spectra1964.com or call them at 801-797-0642. Studio One from PreSonus is the ideal DAW for your home studio, taking you from songwriting all the way through mixing and mastering with a full suite of virtual instruments, guitar amps, and plugins for creative inspiration. It's easy to use for the beginner, yet fully customizable for your high-speed workflow as you become an expert. Get started now with Studio One Artist and PreSonus Sphere for access to all software learning and creative collaboration at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Bill Schnee, an internationally renowned producer, engineer, and mix master. In a highly decorated career that spans 5 decades, Bill has engineered many gold and platinum albums with a wide variety of artists that include Three Dog Night, Barbra Streisand, Neil Diamond, Rod Stewart, Chicago, Steely Dan, Natalie Cole, The Jacksons, Marvin Gaye, Dire Straits, Ringo, Barry Manilow, Carly Simon, Michael Bolton, George Benson, the Pointer Sisters, Bette Midler, Amy Grant and Whitney Houston, to name just a few, including her mega single, I Will Always Love You. Bill also produced multiple projects with Huey Lewis and the News, Boz Scaggs, Pablo Cruise, Joe Sample, as well as internationally renowned direct-to-disc recordings with Thelma Houston and James Newton Howard and friends. In addition to working on dozens of Grammy-nominated and Grammy-winning albums, Bill has been personally nominated 11 times for the Best Engineered Album category and has won twice for Asia and Gaucho, both from Steely Dan. Those 2 multi-platinum releases add to a harvest of hits that includes over 85 gold records, 50 platinum projects, and 50 top 20 singles. Bill also has won an Emmy Award for Best Sound Mixing for a Variety Special and a Dove Award. In 1981, Bill opened his own recording facility in Los Angeles, Schnee Studio. It boasted a large live recording room with a very unique acoustical sound, a custom-made recording console, custom tube mic preamps, and an extensive collection of vintage tube microphones. It was widely regarded as one of the finest recording rooms in Los Angeles. Bill currently resides in Franklin, Tennessee with his wife, Sally, and we are lucky to have him here on the podcast with us today. So please welcome Bill Schnee to Recording Studio Rockstars. Bill, are you ready to rock?
I guess I am.
I guess you are, man. Welcome to the show, dude. It's an absolute honor to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
So, I've kind of given your introduction, but if you were to briefly introduce yourself in your own words, what would you say got you into doing music and recording?
My start?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I was in a band.
That's a good place to start, isn't it?
Yeah. I was in a band in high school. We got signed. As soon as we graduated from high school, we got signed to Decca Records. It was, in those days, it was you did 4 sides, ostensibly singles. If one of them hit, you ran in the studio and did 6 more. We never did 6 more. Got a second record deal, and with a guy named Richie Podler producing. And when I went into his studio for the playback, the first track we cut, I looked up at the speakers and I went, wow. We'd recorded for Decca. We recorded at Capitol and United, and great studios at the time. But what Richie did in that studio, I heard emotion out of the band I'd never heard before. And so right then, it was an aha moment. And right then I turned and pointed at all the equipment. I said, can you teach me how to work this stuff? And he went, no, I'm teaching Cooper. Get out there and do another take. But that was the moment that got me into it.
And this was in Los Angeles? Or
Los Angeles.
And what
1960, do I have to say it? 1964.
Okay, all right. Yeah, that's a cool experience. I mean, I'm sure you've been on the other end of that now, where you've recorded somebody maybe for the first time, and they've walked in and not believed that they could sound, so great coming out of a pair of speakers. Yeah,
I none of them have ever turned to me and said, "Can you teach me how to do this?" But I had a photographer once, a guy that came to photograph a studio session, and he when he watched me work, he got into it. In fact, stayed in the business. He got into movie music, but.
Really put down the camera and picked up the microphone.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, so you did the band thing. You saw the inside of a studio for the first time. I also recall being in a band and seeing the inside of a studio and that feeling of, this looks really cool, I want to do this. How did you go about learning how to do it? Did you go to school for it? Or did you have to find a studio that would let you in?
Yeah, the latter. When Richie wouldn't teach me, I happened to find out I was still living at home and playing with the band and keeping my dad happy in college. So I'm living with my parents, and in the little suburb where we lived, there was a new studio that popped up, and I drove by it, stopped in it for a week, every day for a week, and there was never anyone there. So I didn't know what was happening. It was brand new. But when he finally was there, Mr. Jones, I asked, if he would teach me how to operate the equipment. I told him I'd clean the floors, help him with sessions, whatever he wanted. And so he said, sure. He taught me everything he knew. And the next day, actually, he didn't know very much, and his setup was incredibly Mickey Mouse. It was between the studio and the control room, there was a wall with a window. The studio had egg cartons on the wall for sound absorption. You could do worse. And 2, count them, condenser mics, and a 2-channel mixer with no EQ, and a Fisher Space Expander spring reverb for reverb.
Was that the best piece of gear in there?
That was it. But the good news about that was, at the time, everything, obviously, it was 2-track. Everything was live. You had to mix everything live.
Yeah.
And even though the clients were pretty Mickey Mouse overall, I think the highlight of my career in that studio was there was a small, kind of very small big band with a singer, and I can't even imagine how I did it, but with so few microphones. But
well, so yeah, was there a total of 2 microphones, or were those just the 2 condensers?
2 condensers. There was a bunch of dynamics.
So there was something to mix, and you would use, what was the mixer that you said? It was just a simple one?
A very simple mixer. And the funny story continues. He comes in within 6 months. I was doing all the sessions because he saw that I was better than he was. Just the balancing thing, which is really what once he told me how to plug the mics in and stuff. And I'd been kind of engineering our band demos
Right.
before. So, I mean, I had some kind of knowledge, and this wasn't really professional equipment. I didn't have much to have to learn. But he comes in with a homemade 4-track, half-inch 4-track one day and says, we're going 4-track now. And I went, oh, that's cool. How are we going to do it with this 8-input mixer, stereo mixer? And he said, with this. And with that, he set down another little 6 or 8 input mixer on top of the first one. I said, no, we got to get a console of some kind. And so he found a guy named in San Diego that supposedly knew electronics, and indeed he does. His name was Toby Foster, and he brought him up, and Toby built us a little console, a panel that we put into a housing. And Toby would prove to be very valuable in my life because he got a job at Whitney Studios in Glendale. And when the band finally dissolved and I was just in college, a year later or something, I would go every day after school, and he was a perfect teacher. He's very, very patient. And he would teach, what is a condenser? What is a ribbon? What is a dynamic? What is a limiter? What is a compressor? He was very, very patient. When I introduce him to people, I always say he taught me everything I know.
That's cool. Yeah. And then you said you were engineering some of your band demos. How were you doing that? Did you have your own recording equipment, or you would just go in?
I had a tape recorder, a stereo tape recorder that you could record one channel, sound on sound kind of thing. Yeah. Where you could record one channel over the other. And it was just, we rehearsed in a barn. One of the kids had a barn on the back of his property, and we rehearsed in this very live barn. And it was really just literally one microphone, and then overdub the vocals.
That's great. And do you still have those tapes?
I wish.
Those are hard to hold on to forever, aren't they? If there are any secrets we need to know about keeping track of the things that we record at the beginning of our recording lives all the way through to the end, let us know, because I think we're all struggling with that.
No, there's many from a little while later when I was a little more knowledgeable that I wish like crazy I could hear.
Yeah.
The first thing I did that got on the radio was a Toyota commercial, and I'd love to hear that, what that sounds like today.
And that was one of the ones from the studios you were at?
No, it's a long story, but it was. Go ahead.
Oh, well, cool. So you guys ended up getting a console. Did you say what kind of console you ended up choosing?
Toby Foster built it.
He built it for you.
He just built it. And he said, with your budget, the budget that we had, he said, I can't use professional equipment, but there's some PA cans, octal socket PA cans at the time that he said they're a little noisy, but they sound good, and you'll be fine. And he was right. Mainly what it had that it was important for the clients that came to this Mickey Mouse studio was RCA knobs, rotary knobs. Those were the knob, you know.
Right.
And some colored lights. And that's
we weren't into faders yet, right?
Oh, no.
In fact, we were just talking about that when I had Dana Dowd on the show, talking about her dad and sort of helping to introduce the faders, I guess. It's interesting to think about that. I mean, how did it feel to mix on knobs? Were you?
Well, I had no frame of reference.
Yeah.
So it was fine. The cool part of the story is ultimately 2.5 years later from Richie, from the aha moment where I wanted to learn the stuff, thanks to Toby, engineering just came incredibly natural to me. And I started college in aerospace. And so where the left brain and right brain meet just made learning engineering a snap. It just came very natural to me. And I ended up somehow talking Richie into giving me a job in his studio 2.5 years later. And he was very hesitant because 2.5 years earlier, he knew I didn't know an equalizer from a limiter. But after working really hard on him, he finally gave in, said, all right, we have a publishing demo tomorrow morning. In those days, publishers would have a songwriter come in, put down tracks for 3 or 4 songs very quickly, throw vocals on them very quickly, mix them for them very quickly, and then they had them, and that's what they would use to service to send to people to, do you want to record our song kind of thing. So there was one for that, for a publishing demo for Screen Gems, and I went in, did it, and I called him and said, how did I do? And he said, They said you were great. Okay, what now? He said, well, there's one tomorrow for Warner Brothers. Come and do that one. So I came in, did that one. Good. They liked you too. Said, good. What's next? He said, come tomorrow night and record tracks with Three Dog Night. Okay, what? And this is one of those things that makes absolutely no sense at all. Three Dog Night, he was only engineering them then. He went on to take over producing. They were doing their second album. He went on after that from their third album on and did the lion's share of their hits, but he was only engineering them then. He was also engineering Steppenwolf, and the producer of both of those bands was a guy named Gabriel Meckler, who was obviously his biggest client. Why he would turn over his biggest client with a group that had already had a hit and were working on their second album on to become one of the biggest bands in the country to a snot-nosed kid is absolutely beyond me. And when I built a studio later on, I always think of that when I would hire seconds, and how in the world could he have done that? But anyway, I went in that night, nervous as heck. They were really sweet to me. I cut a track with them, called him the next morning. Well, Gabriel said you were great. What now? Keep going. Now what? Why did he let me keep going? But I went in and cut a track the next night. And third day, come on, no stopping now. Except there was stopping. In the middle of that session, they wanted something on guitar that I just couldn't do. Richie is an unbelievable guitar player. And so he had been helping them with their guitar sounds and stuff, I'm sure. So I had to call Richie, and he came down and took over, and that was the end of my tracking with Three Dog Night. But I did do overdubs, and I hung out and watched Richie like a hawk and just learned as much as I could.
When you say it was something you couldn't do, you mean it was like there was a certain sound needed.
Some effect.
You just didn't know it yet.
Yeah.
But now I'm sure you're aware of that, like this accumulation of all these different, sometimes I think that's what engineering and producing is. It's this accumulation of color palettes for here's how you get a certain kind of sound and here's how you get a certain kind of performance. Do you want to know how I get a consistent sound quality mixing hundreds of episodes of Recording Studio Rockstars? Well, I've been cheating all along by using Isotope RX and Ozone on every single episode. Right now, you are hearing RX declick, declip, DS, deplosive, voice denoise, Ozone multiband compression, EQ, and limiting on my voice. If you want great consistent mixes too, go to isotope.com/rockstars and use the code ROCK10 to get an additional 10% off. Have you ever struggled to finish a mix wondering if it was truly ready for mastering? Wouldn't it be great to have a trusted coach walk you through the final stages of mixing so that you could confidently deliver your mix for professional mastering, knowing that it was just right? At soundporter.com, home of the iterative mastering process, Brian Murphy is your trusted coach to listen to your needs and help you get your mix ready for mastering. Contact Brian now for a free mix review and mastering demo at soundporter.com. All right. So then how long did it take? Maybe you have to go forward pretty quickly to get to starting your own studio.
Yeah. Well,
do you want to talk about your studio a little bit and just to tell us what that was like in LA? I know we got lots to cover before we get to that.
Well, sure. Because of that, obviously my career started kind of quickly, very quickly. And so through the 70s, of course, the dream for Toby and I was to have our own studio. I suppose it's every engineer's dream to have their own toolbox where they can have everything just the way they like it, like your studio here.
Exactly.
And I had some offers during the 70s to people to back me, and it never worked out. But by the end of the 70s, I had been fortunate to have a good amount of success producing, and I had the money to build a studio. And I always say that I had three mentors, and I called Richie the first one, even though he really wasn't a mentor per se, but I learned as much as I could from him while I was working there watching him. And then Toby, of course, I told you about. And the third one would be Doug Sachs. And that started with, I was working at American, and I I did a single on a band called Smith that had a record that ended up a top 5 hit. It was Baby It's You. And I'm still new at all this stuff. And I asked Richie, what do I do with the single? And he said, you take it to 6033 Hollywood Boulevard and hand it to Doug Sachs, and he'll take it from there. And I took it in, and Doug was very impressed with the way it sounded, and that started a friendship that later, down the road a little bit, I would turn into him being my graduate mentor. And he taught me a lot about the nuts and bolts of a lot of things, including technical engineering. Like in the analog world, that less is more, meaning the less electronics you have, the more sound you're going to get. And so Toby and I had the concept for the studio at the end of the 70s when we started designing it, that we were going to build the console because we knew we could build one that sounded better than anything you could buy. And all of my experience with homemade, as it were, consoles were all phenomenal.
Yeah.
And starting with Richie's at the time, which was, in the mid 60s, but still for the time, it was a great sounding console, one of the first transistor consoles. And then onto the studio behind the mastering lab was called Producer's Workshop. And that had a homemade console in it that played in very heavily into my career. That's where I did the tracks on Asia. And so when we knew that we were going to build a console that was like the one at Producer's Workshop, incredibly simple with very little electronics in it. And by then I had learned, I didn't know it in the beginning, I didn't know how important acoustics could be to a recording. And Richie's studio, here I am working in the first real studio, and he had great acoustics. I didn't know it at the time until I left his place and went independent and was working in a brand new studio that looked beautiful, but I could not get a sound in it. And by then, Doug Sachs is mastering everything, and I bring in the recordings that I had done, and he goes, "What's wrong?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, this doesn't sound very good." And then soon he would tell me, "I think you're being fooled by the monitors." And so
interesting, yeah.
And that's when I learned that you can, that all monitors are not created equal. And Richie's studio had, a confluence of things that just worked, including compression ceiling with Altec 604s and utility cabinets, and it just worked, and they were accurate. And here and now, I was in this brand new studio with 4320s hanging on a wall, and I just realized that everything I'm saying right now is probably Greek to most of your listeners.
No, it's all right. Some of this carries through. So we were talking about compression ceilings on a recent podcast over at Woodland Studios. And
great studio.
Yeah, thank you. That's where I started out as an intern. But I guess the compression ceiling is this sort of V shape where the point comes down above the mixer's head or something like that, right?
Well, Richie's didn't do that. It was wider than deep, which is normally not the best way, but whatever, to build a control room. But the ceiling just went down into the wall behind you. So the bass just flew right to you, and it just worked perfectly.
Yeah, so instead of the idea of like the speakers being at the mouth of a horn, where the horn opens up in the room towards you where you're mixing, it sort of does the reverse, right? It sort of
I guess
closes down to where you are. But anyway,
so we would so by the time we're designing the studio, I knew that acoustics were important, and that was the main reason I would build a studio. When I went to the architect that designed it, he had designed more studios than anyone in LA. And I told him, I said, I'm doing this to get a room with a sound. That it has to be a sound like the great studios that I've been in that were built in the 50s and 60s. I don't know how to get it. I'll know it when we get it. And if we don't get it, we're going to tear it out and do it again.
Wow.
So I'll come back to that if you remind me. So a room with a sound, very simple electronics, and great microphones, which I had already collected. Toby turned me on to 2 microphones at the beginning of my career, and I started collecting right away. And so I by the time I opened the studio, I had a huge collection of, I think I had 6 251s, if you know what those are out there.
Mm-hmm.
I bought my last 2 when we were building the studio in 1980. the last two for $2,500, and I complained for 6 months about paying so much for a 251. I'd paid $400 and $500 for them before.
Yeah,
I've got a standing offer for two of them right now for $40,000.
Wow,
and I'm holding the guy off. Anyway, so great microphones, and I firmly believed and still do that those are, there's some great mics today, but those original things, boy, those two mics were fantastic. And so great acoustics, great mics, and simple electronics, you're going to get the most pure sound that you can possibly get. There are plenty of boxes, hardware boxes, or shall I say plugins today that if you want to mess the sound up, but there's no box or plug-in that'll go the other way and give you a more natural sound, less electronic, more pure sound. So that was the concept. And to that degree, it was the best of old and the best of new in the studio, because some of what's new it wasn't going to be an old studio. But I did end up using Celotex, if anyone knows what that is.
No, tell us about Celotex.
Celotex, for years I could say, it's the 1 foot square white panels of sound absorption with holes, either symmetrical or random, that I can't even say anymore, because back in '80, I could still say that we're on the ceilings of a lot of classrooms throughout the country. That it was very commonly used.
It's like a conference room sound absorber panel.
Right.
Ceiling panel
You'll still see it on television when the police take the suspect in to interrogate him. And a lot of, but every radio studio in the 50s and 60s, every radio studio used it, and a lot of the great recording studios that were built would use it. And for me, it was just a much better sound deadener than fiberglass, which was the most common in the 70s.
Yeah.
And
it was like mildly reflective at the same time too,
exactly.
Right? So it wasn't just absorption.
Exactly.
Yeah, I feel like you see those in pictures of old studios, BBC studios and things like that. You'd see them on the walls.
Absolutely.
All around you.
And so that's what I did for that aspect.
I know you weren't the architect, but you probably have a sense of this. Does it make it kind of easy to do construction too, to work with panels like that? Is it easier to sort of put it all
because
together?
I didn't know what we were going to do in the beginning necessarily. Let me rephrase that. What I planned on doing was, because the issue is, how much are you going to put in the room?
Right.
It was a fairly large room with a 21-foot ceiling, and how much are you going to use? So I thought the ideal thing would be just picture frames, huge picture frames of it, hang them around until you got the sound the way you liked it. But the draftsman, there was a draftsman in the architect's studio that I found to be much more creative than the architect. And I asked to have him take over as the thing was getting built. And so the studio ended up being beautiful, thanks to Sven. He was a very interesting guy. But he convinced me to not put panels on the wall, but basically to build it in to the wall board. So everything was one panel. It's just that, one level. It's just that at certain places it turned into the Celotex, and so that meant having an idea of how much of it to use.
Or you had to know. And that's one of the troubles, or that's one of the struggles I feel like with all this creative stuff, is trying to decide what decisions you're going to make before you even make them.
Yeah. So I always refer to it. I brought in two of the top acoustical design engineers that had built studios. And in the very beginning, I said, I want a studio that sounds like it was built in the 50s or early 60s. And they would start in with, yes, well, we can do, and they started using coefficients of this and words that I didn't understand. And all I wanted was a simple yes or no.
Yeah.
And so I didn't feel the confidence to do it. So I ended up going, as I say it, with the seat of the pants and prayer. And the seat of the pants was Celotex, because I know that. I love the sound of that. And the prayer literally was how much to use. And all I can tell you is that right out of the box, it sounded incredible. I brought one of them back, one of the acoustical engineers back, because it was a little too woofy and I hadn't put any bass trapping anywhere. And he said, there's two ways to do it that I would suggest. One is easy and one is hard. Well, give me the easy one. And that was to just throw some sound deadening up on the ceiling at 21 feet. I threw it up there, and I absolutely loved the way it sounded. So I called. We built the console, like I said, but the console took a lot longer to build than the studio, and so I had rented a little 16-input, great sounding little 16-input board to shake the room down. And so I called Jeff Porcaro, the drummer and one of my best friends, and asked him to bring the band in. That would be Toto. See if we could hear what it sounds like. And they came in, and the first time I pulled up the faders, I just melted.
That's great. That's exciting. So when you describe it as sounding a little woofy, where might you have made that judgment call? Would you have walked into the room itself and said, it sounds woofy to me just to my ears?
To my voice. That's right. I've done all my listening tests, and I strongly suggest people using those two things on the side of your head. I always find it funny when people go into a studio and clap. That will tell you one thing, but I don't know that. I can tell much more just by talking in a room. Yeah. I just do it the reflections and how they're going to come back. This goes to something that I learned from Doug Sax in my graduate years, which was finding out that measurements don't always translate to what you hear. There can be two amplifiers, and one of them can we're talking amplifiers with 0.0 whatever distortion, where very, very high resolute things that you put in when you're building microphones or equipment. You can have one with 10 times the distortion, and it sounds better than the one with 1/10 the distortion. Yeah, and that we learned early on about that. So we used our ears. So when we built the console, we did literally months of listening to everything that we would put into the console, and meaning I'm talking about listening to capacitors that would go into the amplifiers, switches, because yes, you can hear switches if you have high enough resolution.
How do you listen to a capacitor? You just hold it up to your ear and listen for the ocean?
Very funny. No, it was done. Doug taught us that everything would be compared to a piece of wire. So if you have a source, and ostensibly this source better have a lot of resolution going for it, better tell you something. And you have a very high quality silver switch, and one side of the switch is a piece of wire, and the other side of the switch is whatever you're testing. And when you going back and forth with the switch, and you hope that you try to have it sound like the piece of wire, which is nothing. And if it can't sound like nothing, that's the ideal. But if it has some kind of sound, then you want the sound to be euphonic in a positive way. You want to like what you're hearing.
Yeah.
But the goal is to not hear when you're putting things together.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a guy named David Sauls who has a cable company called Wire World, and he had described that to me. He said when you're trying to design longer 25-foot or cables, you start with a direct connection or a teeny piece of wire from one thing to the other, and then you listen to the cable. And if you can get it to sound like there's no difference, then that's the measure of success.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that it's so simple when you think about it like that, but yet it's so hard to practice it.
Yeah, but that depends on a lot of things. One of the main things that Doug taught a lot of us, including George Massenberg, who's a good friend of mine, he'd be glad to tell you that he learned critical listening, which he now teaches at McGill and in master classes at Berklee School of Music. Critical listening, and that's almost a lost art in today's world.
Yeah,
but it was everything back then when we're trying to get the most resolution possible out of everything.
So, you're talking about the studio and the monitors, and you're talking about critical listening now. And I feel like, that evokes the sense of a connection between, well set up monitors and a balanced space, and you're hearing a balance of imaging and things like that, which describes a way of listening to music on a stereo pair of speakers. Do you feel like the outlet for music is sort of, you're seeing it change what people's experiences of what you're listening to and how you're listening to it and all that?
Well, obviously.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, most people are not listening on a decent pair of speakers to music anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone that I don't know any studios that have stopped using good speakers and whatnot. But yeah, it's very, very sad to me. As Doug said before he died, the one thing about the resurgence, such as it was and is, of LPs was at least it got kids listening to speakers again.
Right.
Yeah, because obviously there's so much more music from a good hi-fi system, than there is from earbuds of any kind or computer speakers, that kind of thing.
API Audio has been designing mic pre's, compressors, and EQs for more than 50 years. Every product they make includes founder Saul Walker's original proprietary op amps and transformer designs to make sure you always get that legendary API sound in your studio. Whether you are writing songs for fun or mixing Grammy-winning hits, API has got you covered with individual modules, rack units, and dedicated consoles to make sure your next record is your very best. Go to APIaudio.com. Sometimes you just need a mic that will stand out in a mix. That's when you need the new BB29 Signature Series from JZ Microphones. The unique single diaphragm golden drop capsule gives the BB29 airy highs and smooth mid-range to help your tracks stand at the front of your mix. JZ's handcrafted, fully discreet microphones come with a 5-year warranty and free shipping to the US. You're hearing my voice on the BB29 right now. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the BB29 at jzmic.com. So one of the records you did was Asia with, or how do you pronounce it? Asia or Aja?
Asia.
Asia, okay, great. With Steely Dan. And that record always seemed to represent what you put on a high quality stereo to test how good the stereo sounds.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and I think about that. And you're making that record at a time where the person who's going to receive the record, the consumer, is supposed to have a good quality stereo to listen to it on. Do you feel like that's sort of a critical connection between the whole beginning to end process? Like you need the person who's the listener to have the right kind of listening environment.
Right. And again, obviously once music went to MP3s, it was bound to happen. You know, portable music became something. You know, I remember when the first Walkman came out. I think it was '79, and I had just finished the first album. I did with Boz Scaggs, and he bought a bunch of them and gave them to myself and several of the key players on the record. And wow, portable music where you can walk around and hold it. And of course, it was good for what it was, but then, with a cassette, and it was good for what it was. But then you went back and put the LP on and listened to it for real.
Yeah.
And now there kind of is no for real, unfortunately, in a lot of cases. But it has changed the way we make records and mix records, I should say.
Yeah.
Even me, who's an old hi-fi dog, and I'll go out believing the best for high fidelity music, getting the most music you can with fidelity, which doesn't, at this point, with high resolution digital can be amazing, absolutely amazing. Where was I going?
Well, maybe that's part of bringing it back, is the fact that, if the digital and the portability can begin to deliver high fidelity, maybe there's a good reason to have high fidelity speakers again.
Yeah. Well, and it can, but, because there are handheld players that play 192 digital files, with a good pair of headphones, they're very impressive. Or it's the kind of thing where if that's the only thing you had, you could put it into your stereo system and listen on real speakers.
Yeah.
But that, as I said, being the old hi-fi dog that I am, because, starting with early on in my career, I did the direct-to-disc records. And for those of you that don't know what those were, of course, everything until tape was recorded direct-to-disc. 78s were all recorded direct-to-disc. And then when in the late 40s, when we got tape from Germany, recording tape recording, we everything became recorded on tape recorders, and
microphones.
And the sound, the tape has a sound. It's not a mirror. It doesn't give you back what you had. As I told for years, in the studio, if a band was playing, and like I said, I did everything I could to make my studio the most high resolution place ever was. And I've never been to a studio that had as much resolution as I had. If I had a band playing and they came in for a playback and I rewound the tape, it was not what I had just heard coming through the glass. If it was at 15, the top end didn't go out as far, but the bottom end was pretty solid. If it was recorded at 30 IPS, the top end was definitely more transparent, but the bottom end was kind of soggy. And there was noise and there was some compression.
That's one of the things about tape here too, is having to decide, should I do this at 15 or should I do this at 30?
And as we learned, if you record it, you play it back, that's the best that tape's ever going to sound. With what they did to come up with low noise tapes, if you put that tape away and bring it back in 30 days, it doesn't sound as good as it did the day you recorded it. Let alone if you don't put it away and you record on it with capstans and pinch rollers, smashing the tape over and over and over and over again. And let alone if you're recording on track 5, what's going on with the race bias on 6 and 4. All in all, you end up destroying whatever sound you had when you recorded it. And then, so we got digital, and which promised to be a mirror, but unfortunately, early digital, as in CD quality, 16 bits, 44.1, has all kinds of artifacts with it to my ear, and
not a great mirror yet.
No, not a great mirror. But what happened with me is that I was recording. When tape started getting bad, in the 90s, there wasn't enough of it being used, so that you buy a batch of tape and for half-inch for mixing, and you couldn't get the VU meters to not look like a windshield wiper. I started mixing on a SACD recorder, a 1-bit recorder, and Doug Sachs came to me at one point and said, "Why don't you go back to PCM but at 192?" And I said, good Lord, the only one that I had heard, it definitely, you could feel that it went out farther, but it was very electronic sounding. And his design engineer at that time, I had a conversation with him, Josh Florian, and he said, "Let me think about that." And he came up with a different topology than people were using. And he said, if I make a converter for 192 only, and so there's no compromise with this different topology, I think it could be great. So I commissioned him to do it. He brought it in, and the next album I mixed it through his converter to 192, and I mixed it on the SACD converter. And I took it in with Doug, and we blindfold compared the two, and the SACD was good, but Josh's was gooder. And with that, Doug said, this really impresses me. Why don't you see how good it really is? Get some live musicians, go in the studio and see what it can do. So I had been working with Sergio Mendes, and I got some of his Brazilian musicians to come in the studio, and I recorded them. And the interesting thing was, for the first time, going from through the glass to the throughput on the digital, there was absolutely no difference, no artifacts, nothing for me. And I was blown away. And so that caused me to start, which I have started, a record company for recording everything live like we did with direct-to-disc. Oh, I forgot to talk about that, what that was. But I'll go back to that. But everything live, but only one song at a time, but to this very high resolution digital.
That's cool.
And it's very cool. So Doug Sachs had opened the mastering lab at the end of the 60s, and he knew that recording direct to disc would sound better, but because of that whole, what I said, you would eliminate 2 generations of tape, the multi-track tape and the mixdown tape, and you would eliminate going through the console electronics one time. You would only go through once instead of twice. And there was this great studio behind him that producer's workshop that I spoke of earlier, where I did Asia later on. And so when he opened the mastering lab, he did a little album with his partner, Lincoln Mayorga, who was a great arranger and pianist, of Lincoln arrangements. And it was really just to show off the mastering. People would listen to that and see how clear it was. And they'd say, this is what our mastering can do. And then he did another album with Lincoln in 71, because he started selling them to hi-fi stores around town. And I was hoping he would have me engineer that one because we'd become good friends by then. But no, he got someone else to do it. But then in 73, he did a third one, and that I did engineer. And that was that. And so when you do an album direct to disc, you are doing one side of the album, start to finish. Cut 1, cut 2, cut 3, cut right, go, go, go. And
we're talking about a vinyl disc here.
We're talking about a vinyl disc. And it was pressure filled. But in fact, what was funny is I never smoked, but somebody had some of these Tiparillo type small cigars with a wooden tip on it. And I asked if I could have one before one of the takes. They were 15-minute takes of song to song to song. And I put the thing in my mouth, and when the take was over, I pulled it out, and the wooden tip was all splinters. And but when we were done, in 3 days, we had recorded, mixed, and mastered an album.
So wait, the wooden tip was all splintered, not because that's how long it took to burn down, but because you chewed it to bits because it was so stressful?
Right. It wasn't lit. I never lit the thing. It was just me chewing on it instead of gum.
That's wild.
And I left there and went back to normal recording, multi-track recording, and it felt like I was in slow motion, everything, you know.
Yeah.
So that was the most fun that I'd ever had in the studio. So a year later, I came up with the idea that for them to let me produce an album, and I wanted to do it with a vocalist.
And what year was this again? Or what?
74 was 74, when I came up with the idea. And it took Doug about 2 weeks to accept that maybe I could do it. It took him about 2 months to convince his partner to let me do it, Lincoln, who would say, of course, look, this isn't a record label. It's just to do my music. Why, And Doug was saying, but I really think this kid can do it. And he said, and a vocalist? I mean, anyway, 2 months it took him to convince Lincoln. And I'd only worked with 2 people at that point, singers, that I knew could walk up to the microphone and deliver a performance. One of them was Barbra Streisand, who I'd done 2 albums with at that point. And I went to her manager and tried to tell the concept of this little record company that we want to do something direct to disc. And the old cliche from the movies, go away, kid, you're bothering me, wasn't too far from what I got from him. And the other singer that I just worked with was a new singer on Motown named Thelma Houston. And she had a gorgeous voice, and I had done vocals with her that were just nailed. And so I did go to her, and she loved the idea. And I went to Motown, who I had just done a Marvin Gaye live album with, and they went for it. And so that's who we did it with. And that record, Thelma Houston, that record took off like crazy in the hi-fi market. But it came out in 75, I think. I did it the next year. And, by the end of the year, a year later even, it was in every hi-fi store in the country and soon the world as a demonstration disc, because the weakest link in a hi-fi system almost always has been the source. And so here they had a really great source, sounding source with some really good performances on it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've had experiences where I started out with all the multi-track stuff, and then I think the first time I took my band in and we just used a mixer and went straight to a DAT tape, and I was, again, it's not the same level of high fidelity, but I was so struck by the purity of the sound without messing with things and going to the multi-track and coming back. And then I did the Bonnaroo hay bale studio for years, and we would do the same thing. We would mix straight through an analog board and then later a digital board for convenience, but through a board straight down to the 2-track. And there's a thing that happens, between live performance and between the simplicity of the signal chain that's so valuable.
Yeah. Well, that's coming back to the modern times now. That's why what I've started to do with Bravura Records is that very thing, is to capture performances, which you will get with live, and ostensibly with the best sound I've heard on record and recording to this high resolution digital. Another one that I did that I really came out fantastic was James Newton Howard and Friends. James Newton Howard, I met James early on, but he became Elton's second keyboard player, and today he's one of the top film composers in the world. But back then, he and the guys in Toto were endorsees of Yamaha, and part of their endorsement agreement was they played at the NAMM show every year in January. And so I happened to stop at Jeff's house one day in December when they were rehearsing. And I heard what they were doing. They had written these instrumentals, and I knew it was obvious. There's this unbelievable band, and it was all on synthesizers. And so I told Doug about it, and we ended up doing it the following year. Because I told him the hardest thing is going to be getting these guys in a room, because Toto had taken off and James had his career going. And so I knew in December they'd be rehearsing again. And so that's when we did it. And it was the hardest one I ever did, just because normally when you set up a board, you have, after kick, snare, whatever, you have guitar and key piano or, whatever. This was just, obviously the drum, and I added percussion. Jeff's father on percussion, Joe, but then it was David Paich, synth 1, synth 2, Steve Porcaro, synth 1, synth 2, James Newton Howard, synth 1, and I had to memorize every sound on every song to know what I was fading.
Oh yeah, because it's live mixing.
Because everything is live, and that was direct to disc, 5 songs in a row. And including things that would throw me even more, which was in one song, for instance, Paich is playing some sound until the solo, and then he's playing synth bass until the solo, and then he takes over the solo, and Steve Porcaro, who's playing a different sound, takes over synth bass.
Same instrument feed?
Yes.
So you got to, all of a sudden, your fader represents
echo
a totally
off on one
thing.
and pan it to I think one of them I got away with the second synth, but yeah, it was a nightmare. And
wow.
At my age, my memory is doing really good, and I'm extremely agile on a console. I move very quickly. I've always done things very fast anyway, and I know I could do another direct to disc today, but I don't know that my memory is good enough that I could handle that kind of a direct to disc. I'd need to know what everything was. Don't have to memorize that.
What were some tricks for doing that well? Did you find that it was better to rely on just yourself and a clear memory, or would you use pieces of tape with marks on them and rely on other people to help?
Well, on direct-to-disc records, on all of them, it was mandatory to have someone to my left that had notes on every song. I would give him the notes and what to do, what it was going to happen, but because there would be things even on Thelma's album or any of the other albums where I'd want to change things between songs, instrument changes or whatever. And so he would have copious notes of what to tell me, to warn me. And, most of them would take place at the end of a song before the next song. But oftentimes, guitar solos coming or whatever. All that kind of stuff.
Like doing a theater production, you've got notes.
Yeah.
If you're doing lights or sound, you've got to have notes.
Yeah.
Or a score if you're doing classical recordings. Have you done a lot of classical recordings? Or I know you've done a lot of strings and things.
Oh, yeah. I've done a lot of movie scores.
Orchestrals,
that kind of stuff. Yeah, I love it. I absolutely love it. But not legitimate orchestral.
Not an orchestral hall. Okay, cool. During the height of record making, the Spectre 1964 100 series preamp was the perfect choice to build consoles for Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, Stax Studios, Ardent Studios, and New York City Record Plant, bringing you the sound of ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, King Crimson, John Lennon, and many more. The 100 series amplifiers offer extremely stable, high-speed circuit design with unequaled headroom, low noise, and linear output, irrespective of transient audio peaks, giving you cleaner, punchier dynamics dynamic recordings. The Spectra 1964 legacy is carried on today through Bill Cheney and Jim Romney. Now you can get that same incredible sound in your studio with the STX Mic Breeze, BBDI, and comp limiters. Go to Spectra1964.com or call 801-797-0642. You're hearing my voice right now on the JZ BB29 microphone, the Spectra 1964 STX 100, and C610 comp limiter. A gold bar should be kept safe in a vault because it's valuable, but it could be replaced if it was ever lost. One of your songs or recordings, on the other hand, is worth more than gold because it's one of a kind. It's you, and if it was ever lost, it could never be replaced. So wouldn't you feel better knowing your music was safe? This is why I like to have a dedicated system drive, audio work drive, virtual instrument storage drive, cloud storage, and an extra large backup drive in my studio computer. And when I'm finished with the project, I move it onto a dedicated pair of external drives for archiving. Thanks to OWC, I can count on my drives being super fast, reliable, and secure so that I can work quickly and sleep soundly at night knowing my music is safe. I want your music to be safe too. Discover the best options for storage and backup for your studio from OWC at macsales.com/rockstars. Have you ever wished you could remove the click-track bleed from a singer's vocal mic, the sound of shuffling feet from a full choir, or clicking noises from the valves of an otherwise brilliant trumpet solo? These are just some of the incredible things I've been able to clean up, edit, or remove from a recording using the magic of iZotope RX. Great for mixing with a collection of plugins for your DAW to manage plosives, clicks, S's, noise, buzz, reverb, breaths, and even guitar fret squeaks with the set-it-and-forget-it simplicity that lets you focus on your creativity in the studio while you let iZotope handle the audio challenges. If you've ever wanted to truly feel like a magician in the studio, then iZotope RX is your magic wand. Go to iZotope.com/rockstars in the show notes and use the code ROCK10 to get an additional 10% off your first purchase. Hey everybody, we're back now. My guest today is Bill Schnee, joining us to talk about making records for, did you say it was 5 decades?
Yeah.
You've seen the recording process go from, I guess the direct to disc stuff you described was a little bit more of going back to something cool for you.
Exactly.
But you've certainly seen it evolve from one kind of recording all the way to computers and the digital stuff you're talking about.
Yeah. Considering in my Mickey Mouse studio, I was recording on 2-track, but very soon thereafter was the first time Sirius Studio was already 8-track by then. And then by the time we did my Thelma Houston record, I think we were 16-track. But Thelma Houston was direct to disc. Yes.
So 16-track is in the console or is in?
No, I mean, I'm just saying the state of the art. You were
I see.
mentioning how I had gone, and I went from. Yeah, we were 16 tracks. So going to direct to disc was definitely going back.
Do you remember having a sense at 16 was like, what am I going to do with all these tracks? Or like you knew exactly what you were going to do with them?
Yeah, I knew. I guess that was the one where a lot of people were going, why do we need so many? From 8, it was like, and it just meant, more putting off more decisions, having more options and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, I imagine you guys really appreciated being able to create vocal stacks and then bounce them down tracks and things like that. And then drums. I mean, do you think it was pretty standard to consider drums, as 4 tracks, sort of kick, snare, and then a stereo pair or something like that?
Yeah.
That's kind of the go-to.
That's, that was pretty much it for sure. Tom's went in with the overhead and hi-hat.
Right. Were records at this point, were toms like a big deal? Were toms like big, booming, powerful things, or were they often just kind of parts of fills? Or is that a dumb question to ask? In
a way, because there was not as much as eventually it would evolve into when individual sounds became really individual sounds. But there was occasion to have some of that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, so I want to make sure we ask you about this before we go into a million questions about records and things. You have a new book that you're writing.
I do.
Tell us about that. It's exciting.
Well, I love telling stories. And as you can imagine, with the incredibly blessed career I've had, there's a lot of stories. And so I've thought about it for, people were suggesting it for years, but it was when 3 people in 4 weeks suggested that I do it. And the third one is the one that did it. It was a Brazilian artist that I was mixing. And when we were done, they took me to dinner, and the producer asked how I got started. And I told him, and 15 minutes into that, he said, "You should write a book." He said, "The record business as we know it," well, maybe now knew it. "The record business as we know it was born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s, and peaked in the 70s, going into the 80s. It was a very short time, very iconic time, never to be repeated again. And you were there." And the "you were there" was what got me, because my thing for not writing a book was I always thought it's too self-serving. It's going to be, I did this, then I did that, then I did this, then I did that. Now I could tell some stories that had nothing to do with me. They're just fun behind-the-scenes stories. So unfortunately, a lot of that might have gotten cut out. I don't know. But
do we have a title for the book now?
The title of the book is Chairman at the Board, Recording the Soundtrack of a Generation.
That's a great title. I love that.
Yeah.
And so what's, what is your goal for this? Is it sort of specific about different records and things? Is it recording techniques? Is it the stories of the process and your story?
Yeah. There's not a whole lot about recording technique. It really, as I said in the intro of the book, I've written this book for anyone like me that loves music and records, but hasn't been as fortunate to go behind the curtain, so to speak. And when I finished the book and turned it in, the publisher said, "I like your voice in it, but I think, for educational purposes, you should put some stuff in there like that." So I went back and wrote 15,000 more words. And what the editor did that I like is he put it as an appendix, so that if it really is like the guy next door that just loves music and records, when he gets to that more of that educational type stuff, he can stop. And who knows, other people may start at the back of the book and read that first. I don't know, but it's not a super how-to. It's mostly on concepts and whatnot.
Yeah.
There's so much how-to out there now, a lot of which is...
We need more why-to.
Yeah.
Well, that's very cool. Well, do you have any particular concepts or any sort of moments about writing the book and sharing a concept that were particularly exciting for you that you want to share?
Maybe. There's one thing that came up when I was writing it that just came out that I didn't realize. And I was talking about the fact in the book that in the 70s, we were definitely trying to perfect things. I mean, that's what multitrack did.
Yeah.
You can't perfect when you do live recording, and I think a little too much is made out of perfection. Take tuning vocals, for instance.
Right.
The average person doesn't know if something is a little sharp or a little flat. Yet artists today will not let it go the teeniest bit sharp or the teeniest bit flat. What people at home will recognize, of course, is emotion. And so, as I've always said, I can think of a lot of artists that if singing in tune was important, they never would have had a career. Perfectly in tune, 100% in tune, would never have had a career. Thinking about how we worked for perfection in the 70s, I would tell my friends, we don't make records for the people that buy them. We're making records for each other, trying to impress our peers. Because that's kind of how I looked at it. Because again, the same thing with what people at home think.
You felt that back in the 70s? You were aware of that kind of...
No, this was a little later, when into the 80s.
But it's part of that sort of trying to achieve perfection. You begin to think, are we just making it for each other?
Exactly. So that probably is when I first thought of it. And I've never thought it was wrong to assemble a performance, to do that kind of thing. But I did see early on how easily you could miss the emotional boat by doing it.
Yeah.
As a result, my motto became, and sticks with me, in music, work for emotion, not perfection.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And it's a deep concept that, I almost think you start with it and then it eludes you and then you have to rediscover it again. Because I don't think you would give a shit about music if it wasn't for emotion to begin with.
Right.
To get into it.
I mean, that's ultimately what art is. It's playing, so, and that's what you're communicating. The artist is communicating something emotionally through the playing and singing that somebody is going to receive emotionally. And today, it's even, I wonder, so many people, with the way they're making records, which is one instrument at a time, that you almost have to kind of work to get the emotion in a way.
Yeah. I always described it as building a house one brick at a time. And then I realized it's a silly analogy because you do build a house one brick at a time, except for maybe it's building a house and forgetting to have a really great architectural plan before you start,
And, I don't, so as not to be an old fart, even though I am an old fart, so as not to be an old fart with regard to how records are being made today. In fact, funny enough, I have just done my first production with an artist where the only microphone was her vocal mic. The whole thing was done in a computer, with samples and whatnot. I have to tell you, I really loved it. I really enjoyed it. So it's a whole nother way of painting, as it were, almost a different set of brushes. Now the emotion is, it's a different kind of thing, but you can do it. It's just a matter of concentrating on it.
Yeah. So let's rewind a little bit on that and stay on that topic. Obviously, when we talk about vocals, especially if we talk about a vocal and a programmed record with only a vocal mic on it, pretty obvious we're going to be considering the concept of vocal comping. But comping goes for much more than vocals. It goes for every instrument. It goes for the band takes. It goes for the full band performance. And I feel like that's at the core of what you were just saying, that just because you can do all these things doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up with what you wish you had ended up with, because you might have left all the emotion on the cutting room floor, if we're going to use a film analogy, right?
Right. And that, well, you said it when I said what I said. You said that's so important, and believe me, guys, it really is. If there's a way to, and how do you teach that to somebody?
Well, that's what you're here to do.
Oh, great.
How do we do it, Bill?
Well, I don't know. All I know is it has to be at the forefront of your mind instead of the greatest snare sound or the greatest, whatever sound. And I'm not saying it's not to say that sounds aren't important. Of course they are. But boy, whatever it takes to in putting the thing together just to strive for emotion instead of the perfection thing.
Yeah. So I'm not saying sounds aren't important, said the guy who recorded Asia. So maybe you can talk about that record a little bit and working with Steely Dan. What were some of the things that were really exciting for you about working with those guys? How did you end up making a record that seemed to strike a balance between emotion and performance and
Asia,
high fidelity?
Asia is one of these freaks of nature. Suffice it to say that they sort of mixed things up for that record. They did several things differently. Instead of they definitely, it was all super high quality, the best musicians. It started with, they played a little bit in overdubs. They didn't play anything on the tracking dates. And that's really all I did was the tracking dates on Asia. They asked me to mix it at the end, and I said I could never mix with you guys. And that's because back then I mixed for performance, right. Like the very thing that made direct to disc, my love of my life back then was the idea of mixing for performance. And I knew that they were going to have a microscope and be going under keeping under it forever.
Yeah.
But here they came, and when Gary Katz called me and asked if I would like to record the next Steely Dan album, I said absolutely. And he said we're going to have a revolving door of drummers, and okay. And knowing that Jeff Porcaro, who by then was becoming one of my best friends, who ultimately would, having Jeff Porcaro had played on the previous 2 records, and in the revolving door of drummers, he wasn't there. And I'm not exactly sure why. I wish I'd asked. But we had a revolving door of drummers, which was incredible to deal with. And especially when the Steve Gadd character came to town, because I was aware of him from 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, Paul Simon's hit, with that great drag snare thing going. But anyway, back to so this crazy confluence. So here we started doing, they came in every day with demos of bass and piano, Donald and Walter's demos. And at least half of the time, somebody in the band would say, that's perfect. Why don't you just overdub the drums on that? You've got a track. No, we'll get it better. And ultimately, we probably did. I don't know. But they were great demos. And we, I'm jumping ahead.
But it would have been an overdub. It would have been overdubbing to something. And I'm guessing you're about to take us to how this was more of a live thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what we were doing. Yeah. We had a big, a full rhythm section, a live rhythm section with the charts laid out and everything by Larry Carlton.
Great guitar player. Great musician, fabulous musician. Yeah. So you guys had the demos, revolving door of drummers. I guess the first question that would come to mind for me is imagining different drummer. Is it a different drummer every day kind of thing, or
every other day maybe, or
every
something?
Other day,
every few days.
And then how much do you feel like? So that must have been I don't know if it was a crash course for you at this point in your career, but it was certainly like a cross section of here's what different drummers sound like and what kind of sound comes out of the speakers. How much did your way of recording them change from drummer to drummer, or stayed the same?
It stayed the same. It was the same basic setup. The drum sounds varied because of the different kits and the different guys playing it.
Yeah.
But back to what I was trying to get to eventually was, so here we are recording this unbelievable music. Every day I would get in the car and with a cassette of what we had done, I'd throw it in, and I'm driving home listening to it going, what in the world is this? Is it jazzy? Is it rocky? Is it
right, because it didn't have all those background vocals on it and everything yet either.
No. And some of them had, not all of them, because all the lyrics weren't done, but some of them had a rough vocal for sure. But it was like, I didn't know what it was, except I knew it was incredible. And then what happens, which is so odd, the record is finished, comes out, and does what it does. And for the next record, they changed everything up. They go to New York instead of LA, and the Asia sessions were very relaxed and going for a performance. It wasn't, beating anyone up. And on Gaucho in New York, I remember Jeff came back from New York after spending, I don't know how long, where he said, they just beat me to death. We had I played the same song with 2 or 3 different rhythm sections, and all they were trying to get was a drum performance anyway. It was just crazy, which ultimately, in their search for perfection, led Roger Nichols, who was engineering and always a part of them, to design the original Wendell, which was arguably the first drum computer.
It looked like little Atari game cassettes, and you just jam it in the front.
Well, his first one, the one for Asia, though, was a big thing before he product.
I'm describing the future generation.
The one you could buy, but the original one was a computer sitting there.
Wow.
But, they just changed everything up. And, Gaucho is a great album too, but, for me, it's not as relaxed or whatever. And they had all kinds of problems during that, but in making it, including one of the songs being erased by a second engineer. I think he's alive.
Do you think as artists, we have an opportunity to avoid that process? In other words, we can start by capturing performance and relaxing into creation, do you think it's inevitable that we go for that a next step is to struggle through perfection before you sort of understand it in hindsight?
Yeah, well, this can definitely, it's human nature to a degree. That was their fourth or fifth record. I can't remember. But in another sense, because of how it was perceived, it was a landmark and ultimately stayed. It was the first gold record, I think, that they had.
Asia was.
I think.
Yeah.
I think so. And, there's a thing that we always talk about with when an artist makes it, that the next record is the rough one, the
Right.
sophomore one,
Yeah.
if they're lucky enough
Sophomore
to.
slump or whatever.
Yeah, because the first, and then there's some reasons for it. The first record, they might have been working for years, putting it all together and everything. Then if the first record starts to take off and do anything, they're out on the road. There's less time to write, so on and so forth. But then there's also the, we did it, and how are we going to do it again?
Right.
So there's an instant pressure.
Also, what are we going to write about? We're just going to write about struggling to have to do it again.
Yeah. And so maybe there was a bit of that in there. I don't know, but it just seemed odd that everything changed.
Yeah.
On the next record.
And yet, I don't know the success of both of those records, but is part of the irony of it all that Gaucho did just fine as a record financially and as a success being released, or did it have its own set of? I mean, did it have its own set of troubles getting out there and getting
that? I don't know.
Okay, right.
That I don't know.
Well, very cool.
But one funny anecdote to that story is, something like 6 months after. Well, first of all, they asked me if I would mix the record. I said it would never work because my style and yours. Well, you'll try it, won't you? I said, sure, I'll try it. So 6 months later, they called. We got the song done. It was Josie. We met at Cherokee Studios, and I put it up, and look, it didn't work. Let's just say our styles are too different because I got a mix going and put it down like I thought, and then they wanted to, well, what about this in this section? And what about that in that section? And, I was really good at tape editing. I love editing tape.
Yeah.
But what I didn't love was doing mixes and edits, which a lot of people did, where you mix 8 bars and then you mix the next 8 bars and cut it on and mix the next 8 bars. A lot of people did that. But that wasn't for me. Like I said, I wanted it as a performance. And they would have been cut out for that perfectly. But so at the end of that first day, we shook hands and said, it's just, it's just not going to work. I don't think you guys won't be happy. I won't be happy, whatever. So they went and mixed with who had already started becoming, and now a great friend, and Elliot Shiner, who is a much more patient man than I am. And although his memory is suffering just as bad as mine, I did in an interview for the book the other day, someone asked me about how many tracks the drums were on. And I said, I don't remember. Maybe Elliot will remember since he mixed him. And I texted him and he wrote, he didn't know either. So
yeah, I can imagine. I'm wondering now, you described Elliot as much more patient. And I know, you have a passion for the live thing. And we were even kidding around about being, have energy, like we're kind of bouncing around when we're in the studio. And I wonder if that's part of a personality that makes for a good front end of a record and the performance aspect, appreciation for moving quickly and all that. And maybe on that back end on mixing, maybe personalities that do well there are just incredibly patient with a million revision requests.
Well, that is to say, what you're saying is that I haven't done well with my mixing. Because
let's go
I
there.
think this interview is over. No, I love mixing. I just like to do it fast.
Yeah.
Now, believe me, in the modern era here, you can't be fast. I'll just describe it. What happened was when computer mixing came in, I had to adjust.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like it at first. I don't want your help, and I had to adjust to it. And then, of course, that was just having the faders move.
Right. Just moving faders.
Just the moving faders. I had to adjust to that. And then now, believe me, though, the old dog adjusted to the new tricks. And now that I'm in Pro Tools for years and years now, I'm fine to let it help me.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah.
There's no going back. Although I still try to move as quickly as I can because that's just how I just think my creativity comes when it's bang, bang, bang,
Yeah,
bang.
I think that's smart. And then do you still prefer having faders in front of you, even if you're mixing in Pro Tools?
I gave it up. It was hard, but I gave it up.
So you really just adopted the mouse and adapted to and adopted the mouse.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Yeah. All I do, I try to make it as good sounding as possible. So, because it definitely sounds better on a console. If you got a great console, it definitely is going to sound better. But it just became too much because so many people were in the box, and we're going back quite a few years now, that the record company or the producer or the artist, they would want these infinitesimally small changes that meant resetting all the hardware up for a console mix. And a lot of the hardware aren't detents, it's pots, and you got to try back it up somehow. Photographs, tape recordings, whatever. We tried them all, and then sometimes the mix comes back the same, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it was better, but a lot of the times it wasn't as good, and you drive yourself crazy. So I finally gave up and threw in the towel and said, "All right, I'll just stay in the box." So all I do for the sound is I've got some custom D to A's. 16, I come out 24 wide, 16 custom D to A's transistor, and 8 tube D to A's.
Wow.
All from Josh Florian, JCF Audio. And so I'm summing analog with a very, very simple system. And because there again, in digital is not the same as analog. Less isn't necessarily more in digital. You can get away with a lot more in digital. But it's still, we get it, we turn it into analog because last time I checked, our ears are analog. So as long as we go to analog at a certain point, I just do it, like I said, mixing it through as simple it's a very simple network with one stereo amplifier on it. And that allows me to use, I have in a rack, I have a couple of transistor and 2 or 3 tube stereo compressors to put on the bus, in addition to anything in plugins that I might want to use.
Cool. PreSonus has everything you need for your music or podcast production. Studio One is a great choice for your DAW, whether you are writing songs, creating EDM and pop music, recording bands, mixing, mastering, composing for film, or recording voice and producing a podcast of your own. A flexible sketchpad, chord charts, key recognition, effects pedals, amp simulators, virtual instruments including a killer drum machine, built-in vocal tuning with Melodyne, and 37 fantastic sounding plugins for mixing will allow you to create whatever inspires you. PreSonus provides you everything you need for your studio, from microphone to digital interface to headphones and speakers, so that you can easily set up your home studio for professional production. Get started now with the low-cost Studio One Artist and join PreSonus Sphere for access to all their software, a complete learning library, and creative collaboration in the community at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. If your goal was to climb Mount Everest, you would hire a Sherpa to guide you to the summit. If you wanted to sail around the world, you would hire a seasoned sea captain for a safe voyage. And if you wanted to try skydiving, you wouldn't just jump out of an airplane without being strapped to an expert, right? So why would you send off your mix for mastering without knowing that it was ready first? Wouldn't it be great to have a professional mastering engineer with a trained ear to guide you through the final stages of mixing? Brian Murphy is your trusted guide at soundporter.com. Home of the iterative mastering process, where you get to interact with a professional mastering engineer who listens to what you want and will give you mix feedback to help you get your mix ready for mastering. Contact Brian now for a free mix review and mastering demo so that you can hear it before you buy it at soundporter.com. Do you mind if I rewind and ask you a question about the drums again?
Nope.
So we don't have to go into what mic are we supposed to use, but I would like to ask you about, I think the kick and the snare are really remarkable on those Steely Dan records. And, Asia, I hear that quick kick drum, and it really makes me think of the 70s, and I think of disco. I just think of so many. There's this focus to the kick drum that sometimes is lost the way I record a record, and I'm trying to gate it and I'm trying to figure it out. Is a sound like that have a lot to do with taking off the front head on a kick? How common was that? What thoughts are there about getting a short, punchy kick drum that doesn't sort of hang on forever, if you know what I mean?
Yes, taking the front head off was quite a common occurrence then. I don't remember which drummers, some did and some didn't. Some had and some didn't have their front head off. I for the life of me, believe me, I wish I could remember what mics I used back then in that studio. But the quickness for sure. It was the fast electronics in that very simple console. That's a big part of the secret of that, because that's what you get when electronics will slow the signal down that's traveling. Once the microphones turned it into electrical energy, that's that whole point of less is more. And so that was a big part of that. I know in the beginning of the 70s, when I left Richie Podler's studio, I could not get a kick drum sound to save my life. I tried every microphone out there, and a lot of the ones that people were using, engineers in other studios were using, I didn't like the 666. Is that what it was? 664. I can't remember. Electro
I'm not
Voice.
sure.
I think it is 666. Yeah. I didn't like it and whatnot, and I think I ended up with Sennheiser 421, which doesn't have a lot of great bottom on it, but definitely was fast in the lower
focus.
mid-range. Yeah. So that's probably what I was using back then on that.
Single mic would have been common, or?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe that's part of the challenge as we get into this, because we can have all these different mics going. We try them all, and then we get stuck thinking that we're supposed to use them all.
Right.
Maybe we don't need to use them all.
Right. The one thing and I would dare say that I still do that, with the exception of once in a, if with the anyone that has the speaker subwoofer that they set in front of a kick drum, if the drummer has that or whatever, that can definitely be effective.
You like that?
Although there's plugins that'll do the same thing. But but I've used that a lot. One drummer in LA that has that, I used it a lot on his stuff. But and then if in a great room, because that's another thing that cracks me up, is that room mics are, I can't tell you how many things I get to mix where they've got room mics and they sound like garbage.
Because the room didn't sound good.
Exactly. It's just, it's like, but they've heard that room mics are important or something, and it's like, no, don't do that. It's better. We can do it electronically. If you haven't got if you've got a great room, you can get a sound that you can't get electronically. It's like everything else, the no substitute for the real thing. But if you got a bad one for room mics, please just don't, why bother, it just destroys the sound. A good room will amplify it and make it bigger and fuller and fatter. And a bad room will take it away.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, room mics are one of those funny things where I found myself using them, and then I'm scratching my head about where they're supposed to be in the sound and the mix and all that. And
well, what I always found great was that, and even in my room, I'd put up some of the best mics I have for that. There's a Neumann mic called the M50 that's actually what most people use on orchestra recording for movies, in a Decca tree, which is 3 mics. It's 3 Omni mics over the conductor's head, like 9, 10, 11 feet up, depending on the room and what you're going for. And they're old tube mics, they're Omni with a nickel capsule, and they're fantastic. And I'll have those in the room. And then there'll be a talkback mic on a couple of people, and the talkback mic comes on, and it sounds better than these M50s.
Right.
Wait, let's just record the talkback mic also, and then find out later. You decide later. So
yeah, that's funny that you're experiencing that. Even like I've described that too. It's like the scratch vocal mic ends up being makes the drum sound better. And then you're like, crap, I can't use it because there's a scratch vocal.
Yeah, vocals in there.
And then the irony would always be, then I'd go, well, I'll just go set up a mic just like the scratch vocal mic and make it a drum mic. And then I listen to them like, but it doesn't sound good anymore. I don't know why. Okay, cool. So, I know you didn't mix Asia, but listening to that, I'm listening to the snare, which sort of has this really iconic splat, great sound. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, even the snare is very quick on that record too. It doesn't hang around for too long.
Again, the electronics. Go on.
Okay. And then I was thinking, were they doing things like parallel compression and gating it and adding it in, or any of that kind of stuff?
I don't think Elliott did. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
I can tell you this, that years later, about 8 years ago, 8 years ago, the guy that was the second on that confessed that he had made, I don't know whether he took my rough mixes or he did his own, but he had rough mixes of the tracks. And I said, oh, I would love to hear those however many years later, and so on and so forth. And that's the drum sound.
That's wild. That's really great. The cool thing about that too is when you do approach recording that way, where you've got a high quality capture snapshot, then you get to focus on the instrument, the sound of the instrument and the performance and all that. And it's sort of a lot of fun to just make it sound great in the room first, instead of worrying about trying to fix something into, convert something into something else later.
That was the first thing that happened when Gary Katz asked me about recording him. I said, I would love to, but can I pick the studio, please? And he said, sure. And to my knowledge, he or the two guys never came and looked at it until the first day of recording. They just took my word for it, and we just went in and did it there. But I knew that that's where I was going to get the best sound. And and by the way, those out there listening, if you haven't figured it out already, the internet has a lot of false information. Even the marvelous Wikipedia, and I love Wikipedia. It's a wonderful thing.
But not this part of the internet, rock stars.
But my gosh, I had reason to get on there and read about Asia the other day, where it says it was recorded at the Village. No, sorry. I've got the tape to prove it, from that second engineer, that no, I recorded it at Producer's Workshop, not at the Village.
That's great. Well, all right, let's see. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, because you've worked with so many powerful, great singers, a long career of working with really great, top singers. And I wondered if, without getting into specifics of each person or mic choice or anything, I wondered if you wanted to just talk about some of the things that we should be thinking about as we go into work with somebody with a really powerful voice. Whitney Houston, for example, incredible dynamic range, I would imagine, in the studio. How do you even, what are the important things to, you're here, you are in a small room. Would you immediately go, oh, you can't record a voice like that in a room like this? Do you need a big enough room? Does the mic have to be a certain distance? All those kind of things.
Okay. I only recorded her once, and that was I Will Always Love You, which was recorded on set at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami. All the rest of my workings with her were mixing. So for that, anything live is sort of compromise, and you have to make the best of what you can do with it. And to that end, of course, the director wanted as small a microphone as he could get to, he didn't want anything
probably
blocking
video
her
going on,
face.
Right?
Yeah. And film. But it was to be ostensibly she was supposed to be in an arena singing in front of 20,000 people. In the movie, that's what it is. But it was actually just shot in a very relatively a small stage in the Fontainebleau Hotel. And once I made peace with finding the best microphone I could for her, what I did ahead of time was bring a very forgiving compressor called a compeller, which would forgiving in the sense that if she's going to blast, and she did blast, if she did blast, it's going to catch it. And the other thing I did was I put her into two preamps, one of them 10 or 15 dB down from the other one. And they both went into the each side. It's a stereo compeller. It's a stereo device. One went into each side of that, and it went on two different tracks in case. Yeah, that's
is
all
the
you
compeller, am I remembering this correctly? That's not a Valley audio device or something like that, is it? I don't remember.
I can't remember who made it. I can't remember.
Yeah, that's cool. You know, the funny thing is that multiple recording level is something that in fact this mic designer we talked about that, you know, it's potentially one use of a stereo microphone is to use both capsules with different levels. And I have some portable Tascam thing where they talk about it's, you know, in order to make consumer electronics handle all the possibilities of a live recording of voice or music, it can record two different levels at once. And it's just such a simple, clever trick. It's to be prepared for something that's louder than you expected, right?
Right.
And you can cut to it if you need.
I got introduced to that concept very early on because at end of 70 and into 71, I went to work for CBS. It was really my big break, so to speak. And I should come back and tell that story. It's kind of fun. At CBS, the first artist that I worked with was Barbra Streisand. And so you're talking about the same kind of dynamic range, just absolutely insane. And it was Toby that said, you know, if you're doing a vocal, you might think about using two preamps and getting, you know, having some amount down to protect yourself.
Would it be one mic going into two preamps? And
Yeah.
how would you split the mic? Is that important?
No, because one mic, I mean, you know, the stereo idea is a good one from that standpoint. But all I ever did was just take two different preamps on the same mic feed.
You just use a mult at the patch bay on the way into the
Yeah.
mic preamps or something like that? Because if it's the same mic preamp, then the impedance would be matched and it wouldn't somehow load the microphone going into the
Right.
preamps?
Correct. So what the story of going to CBS, it's the real reason that I'm not a lawyer. So my parents, my dad especially, he was a Jewish doctor, and he really wanted me to be a doctor. And I told him I can't be a doctor. And ultimately, in fact, kind of sad, by the time he passed away, I probably had, I don't know, 3 or 4 Grammy nominations and 10 gold records or something. And he was still saying, Billy, when are you going to get a real job? And it was, Dad, this is my job and I love it. And that's what I'm going to do. But earlier than that would have been when I started, after I got hired at Podler's, I started law school to shut him up. If I'm not going to be a doctor, okay, I'll be a lawyer. And I did a part-time program and 4 years instead of 3, but I got through the first semester and we started the second semester. I got the report card and it wasn't happening. I had all C's and a B, and it's because I'd been faking it because I didn't have time to do all the reading and still go to classes and sessions. So I was juggling and it wasn't working. So I decided to quit for 1.5 years after all I had quit 2.5 years for college with the band. So I decided I'd stop for 1.5 years. If music took off, great. If it didn't, I'd go back and get the law degree and then come back and try it again. And it was just about a year had gone by, 1 year and a month or something, and it was just about time to register for the fall. And when a friend of mine, a client of mine that I had worked with, got a deal at CBS. And so I'm mixing one day, and the girl buzzes in and says, Bill, Clive Davis is on the phone for you. Huh? And I very nervously picked up the phone. Hello? Hi, Bill. Clive Davis. How are you? Fine. Joel tells me that you're a very talented musician and engineer. Oh, thank you. What do you want to do with your life? I think I'm going to go back to law school. And he almost interrupted me. No, you don't want to go to law school. I went to law school. And if you've got music in your blood, you're going to want to do it. And I said, well, I would love to, and basically that phone call was, okay, no buts, I'll give you a shot.
Wow.
And so I went to CBS, and very fortunately, the first thing I produced got a top 30 hit, and that was it. So I think the judicial system is probably very happy that I did. That's what my mother said anyway. She was convinced. I don't know, Billy, if you get a decision you don't like, you're going to cuss the judge out and get disbarred. And she might have been right. I don't know. I hear some of these decisions sometimes and I go nuts, but whatever.
Okay, cool. So now, Bill, another one of the artists that I was struck to discover you had worked with, and hopefully this is accurate, was Miles Davis.
Yes.
You did a couple of records, Tutu and Amandla.
Yes.
Both of which I remember.
Yes.
Talk about that. I mean, that's really incredible to work with Miles. And then I am going to geek out on you. Good Lord, what mic do you put in front of Miles Davis before he plays?
Okay. Well, number one, I didn't record those. I mixed them.
Okay. All right.
Number two.
Got off the hook on that one. That's good.
Number two, I did record Miles live. And he was doing the summer festivals in Europe. And so I went to Europe. Tommy LaPuma was producing him, and I went to Europe to do them. And we got the first night, in the afternoon of the first show, we get there, and Tommy introduces me to Miles, and the road manager comes up and says, "Miles, the equipment hasn't arrived from the States, but I've worked all afternoon and I got great stuff." So he goes, "I ain't doing no fucking rented equipment. Cancel the show." And so that was that. And
somehow I knew something like that was coming.
Yeah.
I imagine Miles was a scary dude to sort of begin working with. Like, I would be a little nervous.
Yeah. Well, you come in with that much history, and for good reason.
He sort of famously didn't put up with anything.
Yeah, nothing. It just. In fact, there's a great story. I'm not going to tell it. There's a great story in the book about Miles. That's one of those things I had nothing to do with, but it's a story about Miles and why he left the label he left and so on.
Interesting.
About exactly what you're talking about.
All right. And Rockstars, a reminder, I'm glad you brought up the book again because we didn't mention it, but the link to the book should be in the show notes of this episode. So we're recording this before the book is published. As this comes out, it will be published. Just click through and you can go check it out pretty easily, quickly. So, when I think about those records, though, Tutu and Amandla, I also recognize that Miles was, he was considered adventurous in jazz. He wasn't afraid to go outside of traditional jazz and go and like really usher in the new technology and the new sounds of the 80s and the 90s and stuff.
And he certainly did on that record, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's all the fabulously talented Marcus Miller, who co-produced it and wrote and arranged. Arranged all of it, I think, but and wrote a good bit of it for him. But it was absolutely, drum machines, playing unusual beats and
was it a lot of DX7, Yamaha DX7s?
Well, I don't really.
The keyboards? I don't know.
I don't know. I don't remember without hearing it. But
yeah.
But Marcus is just an insanely brilliant musician. We became great friends. I can't remember the first. I met him in New York doing, I think, George Benson and Earl Klugh, and just loved his playing and his musicianship and whatnot. And in fact, there's when I was getting ready to do another Boz record, I called Marcus and said, "Why don't you write something like would have been on Tutu that Boz can put lyrics to?" And he did, and that was very cool. And what was even cooler on that record, now that I think about it, was one day one day at the end of a session, I said, "Marcus, you want to stay after class and write something?" And he said, "Sure." And so he got a drum beat going, and I put it out in the speakers, in the studio speakers, and I went out to the piano, that's my instrument, and he stayed in the control room with a keyboard, and we would just start playing with ideas. And every once in a while, I'd run in and, have you got anything? And he said, nothing that I love or whatever. And then I'd come in and say, what do you think of this? That kind of thing. And together we put together this cool song, and ended up, how do I get out of this? I put myself in a corner. We ended up making this great record that unfortunately didn't make Boz's record. There was you have to read the book, a horrific story of the power plays in the record business, things that go on that shouldn't go on. And that Other Roads is the record, and it just got all messed up because of the record company, because of megalomania, really power struggles.
Well, there must have been massive power struggles in the 70s at the height of record making too.
Not as much as later, because the good part about the 70s was the record companies the major labels were all run by the people that either started them or made them famous or whatever. They were all really good really good people. And they believed in, for the most part, I discuss all this in the book, they believed in the artistry, and they let the artists do what they did and that kind of thing. And, I have a section about the people behind the music, because it was such a big part of it, and at the big labels. It was later when they sold out when they sold him, and we now had lawyers and accountants running things, that it started getting a little more obscure and messed up.
Now it's all run by lawyers and accountants. Everything's
totally
giant.
Yeah. It's a whole nother thing now. Yeah.
Or it's independent, and then it becomes cool again, I guess.
But since you like Miles, let me give you one of the stories that that's in the book that I had nothing to do with. It's so down the road a piece in the 90s, Toto had written a jazz song, and they thought it'd be great to have Miles blow over it. So they called him and asked him if he would want to do it, and he said, sure. So he's going to show up at David Page's house, and he shows up in a red leather suit, with great big Elvis glasses on at nighttime, knocks on the door, opens the door, and I think Lukather might have answered the door, if I remember correctly, but Page had his German Shepherd taxidermied, and it was sitting there in the entryway. And Miles takes 2 steps in, looks at the dog, and jumps back. And Luke says, "It's okay, he's dead." And Miles says, "I got some shit. Bring that cat back to life." And somehow I have a hunch
that he really did.
that they found out about that. I don't know if they gave it to the taxidermy dog or not, but
what a trip, man! That's wild. Good Lord. All right, so I think about you said you mixed those records, and I think about all the effects, the reverbs on his trumpet, on his horn, and it occurred to me to wonder if some of those choices were printed that way in the recording, or if it was all sort of a new concept at the mix, or was it sort of like, okay.
There was nothing recorded. That was all me.
Because that reverb that goes with his trumpet, the sound that you got on those records, to me as a listener, it was so clearly, it seemed like such a clear intention for that music.
Yeah.
And what makes it so cool,
Yeah. I hope so.
Yeah, so nice work, man. All right, so let's see. What else should we ask?
It was the great thing about that was it was a new canvas. It were new colors, really.
Yeah.
If you look at Miles and his history and what he'd played over, and now we have this whole new kind of backdrop for him. So there was no right or wrong. I didn't think.
Yeah,
I could do whatever.
Yeah, it was super cool, and it really. I don't know. It just really sort of set a color palette for that time too, in a great way, I thought.
There's one thing I can talk about right now that I don't know who's interested in it except me, but this is the old fart bitching. Can I
do it? Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. Record companies. they do so many crazy things. Like, why don't they take better care of their masters? They're always losing masters. A couple of Asia are gone, multitrack. They tried to do a 5.1. They couldn't do a 5.1 because two of them multitracks are gone. I did a thing with an old Marvin Gaye release, which is all a great story, but a 3-track that he did in the 60s of the jazz music at the time. Funny, he was actually a big fan of Sinatra, chairman of the board, Sinatra, and he did an album like that, but he wasn't happy with what he had done. And ultimately, until he transferred the 3, he didn't like what he had done, so he called the session. And then a few years later, he transferred it to 8-track and tried his vocals again. Still wasn't happy. I just haven't lived enough life. Then a few years later, he put it on 16-track. Finally, in 1979, with grams of cocaine, he did all the vocals and background vocals in 2 weeks. And it's a fantastic album. It's called Vulnerable. It's not like any other Marvin Gaye album. When he was done with it, by the way, he said it was the best thing he'd ever done. He gave it to Berry Gordy. Berry said, "You can't put this out. You're an R&B legend. You can't. What are you doing with this old music?" And it supposedly is one of the reasons he left Motown for CBS a year and a half later. But while there had been so many transfers when I mixed the album off the 24-track where he had his vocals and background vocals, some of the songs you could hardly hear the intro. So I had to go back with early Pro Tools, which I didn't like the sound of, but I knew it would work. Transfer the stereo from the 3-track to Pro Tools and have it drive the tape, the 24-track, where I'd get the vocals from it. And so that's what I did. Meanwhile, there were 7 songs on the album on the 3-track, but there was an extra leader. And I went to that leader, and it was Fingertips by Stevie Wonder. It wasn't marked.
Really? Wow. So
when I mention that record companies do stupid things, I just don't understand. Another thing that'll happen, this has happened a lot. When CDs started, they would have somebody, and maybe some of them were good people and good at their job. I don't know. But I know for a fact there were a lot that weren't, that would take the masters in and remaster. And you see this a lot. And I found you see it all the time because there have been reissues of albums where they got the credits messed up. They couldn't even get the credits right. So I know that in the course of writing my book, there's at least 2 albums that I know of that I were there when I started writing the book that are gone now. Like I didn't do them or something. And I have to believe it's a reissue where they messed up the credits, that kind of thing. But I brought all this up to say that another thing they did that wasn't smart, that they continue to do, is when there were new uses for the masters. And this was in the 5.1 while we were doing the 5.1 mixes. You would think that the only intelligent thing to do is to go back to the engineer that mixed it. But no, if they could get someone cheaper, they would get someone cheaper. And the funny story about that, is that Tutu album where Tommy LaPuma was at someone's house that had gotten a pre-issue of the 5.1 and played it for Tommy. And Tommy freaked out. Not only did he hate the mix, it had the wrong solos. And he called Warner Brothers screaming, that because it's in his contract that he approves every mix, and so he called him screaming, "If this ever happens again, I'll sue you." And he got me to remix the album.
Wow!
But whoever did it couldn't even listen and get the right solos, But that wouldn't have happened if they would just have hired
Just pay attention.
Yeah,
hire the right people.
All right, the old guy bitching is done.
The secret to a great mix is to start with great source tracks. And this means you need great microphones. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia brings you the new BB29 Signature Series microphone to help your recordings add clarity and detail to your mixes. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique Golden Drop capsule design with a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity without distracting colorations and distortions. The new BB29 microphone has a Class A discrete amplifier amplifier circuit, extremely low self-noise, and transformer-coupled output to bring an expensive sound to your studio for an affordable price. Jay-Z offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, you can use the coupon code ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the BB29 at jzmike.com. The legendary API sound can be described as punchy and bold with a distinct in-your-face presence. For more than 50 years, API Audio has been advancing their design of consoles, mic preamps, compressors, and EQs, but what API founder Saul Walker got perfect in the very beginning were the proprietary op-amp and transformer designs. And today, API still offers the very best for your studio with dedicated rack units for mic pre, EQ, and compression, and consoles from small to large with the Box 1608, 2448, or full-size Legacy Access, and they even introduced the original 500 series lunchbox to studios everywhere. But most importantly of all, no matter which gear you choose from API, you can count on the original op-amps and transformer designs to make sure you always get that legendary API sound. Because the next record you make could be your best record ever. Visit apiaudio.com. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Want to start mastering your own records? Rockstars of Mastering walks you through exactly how I mastered my own record using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. Want to learn how to create a mix that doesn't suck but rocks instead? At Mixmaster Bundle, I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins so that you can have punchy, powerful drums, guitars that rock, bass you can feel, and a mix that is in your face. Plus, it's totally free as my way of saying thanks for listening. Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now and look for the clickable link in the show notes below. All right, we have some questions also from our audience in advance here. Not a lot, but a couple. Here is one. This one actually comes in from Chaz Root, and he wanted to know how you got the amazingly prominent bass sound in the 1970s. He said that your mixes and productions from that era had a very distinctive feel. So do you have any thoughts about anything happening in the 70s and bass sound?
Okay. Number one, everyone's always asking, if some song they'd like the bass song on, and all I can tell you is I do as little as possible with basses. I leave them alone. Acoustic bass is it's the hardest instrument in the world because, or the easiest. If the box is good, if the instrument's good, there's a lot of things you can do to mic it. If the box is bad, you're never going to get a great sound. I can't anyway, and I tried everything. But electric bass, most of the studio players never used an amp. Some in the beginning of the 70s, they were a B15, an Ampeg B15 they would use. And if they did that, I would certainly mic it with a large capsule condenser mic. But by and large, what I worked for, and ultimately in my studio I've got the best tube direct box I've ever heard, built by a guy that built the console with Toby and I, but just tried to have a good direct box. And when the active ones came out, I liked them better than the transformer ones. Mm-hmm. But, transformers are wonderful for slowing sound down and thickening it. And so that can work to your advantage as far as thickening on a bass.
So you think of tubes as being quicker circuitry than transistors?
Not even close. No, transistors are faster than tubes, for sure.
What did you just say? Which one slows the sound down?
A transformer.
Transformers
slow the sound down.
I misheard you. My bad.
Yeah. In fact, remember where we are, because I won't. Yeah. Since you mentioned the speed, a great story is I go to CBS and I noticed that Toby had told me, check out the tube mics. They've got lots of these great tube mics. And that's when I really got indoctrinated into them. And I noticed that there were three young guys there that were all older than me. I was the youngest, but there were 3 young guys there. They all used the 87, but all the other engineers that were old guys, most of them 15 years younger than I am now, that they all used the U67s. And ultimately, after I started trying them, I agreed. But I remember in the very beginning asking the top guy there, Pete Romano at the time, what about the 67? Why are you using that? And he said, well, when Neumann came over here and from Germany and handed us the first 87s and said, you're going to love this. And we tried them. And most of us didn't like it as well as the 67. And they heard that and they came back. One of the design engineers came back to America to talk to us and said, why are you doing this? And he says, well, I just think it's a better microphone. It feels better to me. And well, what don't you like about the 87? He said, well, I don't know, it's kind of spiky, a little jerky on the top, aggressive somehow or so. No, you do not understand that the transistors are faster, they're much faster than the tube. You are hearing the real transients that are there in the room. You haven't heard them with the 67. And he said, okay, thank you. And went right on using the 67. And
turns out they didn't like all those transients as much.
Well, it's not about the transients. It's about the sound of the transistor versus the tube. Tubes are just they're everything about them for me. There's some kind of magic for me with tubes and transducers. Power amps on speakers. Tube power amps are really lovely. They're not as fast as transistors. You'll hear it very much there, but that maybe you don't need all the speed. If you do, then you use a transistor amp kind of thing. But to this day, I still much prefer a 67. Or
I mean, 87. I think the immediate experience for any of us who are guitar players is the time you play a guitar through a tube amp versus a transistor amp, and you just immediately hear they're not the same thing.
Yeah, there's just. Yeah, it's just a richer sound. And that's one of the best things. I think the top end is better on a 67 than an 87. And the sound is just richer. There's a richness to it. Anyway.
There's my 67. Right
there you go.
There it is.
And so back to the bass before you go on to the next question.
The bass with the transformer and slowing the sound down. Yeah,
so that's, like I said, a good transformer will be nice, fat, and thick. May not be quite as fast as the solid state, the early solid state ones that were out. But I played around with all of them, and there were some good ones for sure.
So the direct box that you have for an electric bass has tubes and transformers in it. Yeah. All right, cool. So it's about having the right circuitry for the bass to go through, and then. I imagine it's also about letting the bass player. Do you feel like bass players have to really hear it coming back through the speakers, or do you think a lot of great bass players just know what their bass feels like in their hands?
Are you talking about headphones?
I guess I'm talking about monitoring for electric bass parts.
Well,
performances.
I mean, headphones in general. When we hit the studio in 1964. I had never used headphones in the rehearsals and whatnot. And now all of a sudden having to play with headphones, I absolutely hated it. It was it's a very unnatural thing until you get used to it. And our careers didn't last long enough that I ever got used to it. But what I did know was how important any group of musicians, how they play is in direct proportion to what they hear. And so, I'm sure the seconds that I trained over the years could show you the scars, I'm just kidding, where I beat into them the idea of the headphone mixes everything. And including having them go out in the room at an early point while the band's getting started and listen out there, because if there's drums in the room, it's a different mix than in the control room where the drums aren't playing and all that. And when the headphone mixers came out, I never went to one. And I still have a little bit of a problem with them, with experienced people that know how to mix themselves. That's great. But if you have a young band, they might not know exactly how to set it up so that they can mix right. Plus, I always like to control with a singer. If I'm controlling the headphones in the control room, if I want them to sing out a little bit more, I'll just turn their voice down a little bit before I ask them to sing out a little bit more and see if that works. Or the opposite. as opposed to then telling them, can you sing out a little bit more? And they don't know to turn it down and the whole thing. So
and are there any things we need to know about will vocals too loud or too quiet in the headphones also affect pitch in certain
that
directions?
depends on the singer. Depends on the singer to me. But, how it usually is if there's people like Whitney or Thelma Houston, people, that have just insanely great pitch, it sort of doesn't matter. And as much as I harped to everybody about the headphone mixes that my guys I trained, the amazing thing is great studio musicians, they would tell me, they would compliment the headphone mix in the studio. And they told me early on, you can't imagine how many times we go in a studio and the mix is so rotten. They get used to playing with whatever. They have to. Right. They have to. But it doesn't make it right. And they really appreciate when they can hear properly.
Yeah, that's good to know, because I think one of the things you learn as you make records is that eventually you work with great people, and then you discover that everything about what sounds so great about that recording has more to do with the band and the performance than it does with me, the engineer.
Right.
And then I'm helping to enhance it a little bit,
Yeah. And normally, it's so funny. There was a time when might be telling, some of the best things that I could say to somebody, it's a group of young people, is I've always looked at engineering and really producing, as my version of producing, as servants' roles. You're there to serve the artist and their music. And what does that look like? Well, you're serving the music. So whatever it takes to make the musicians, and of course the artist being the main person, but everybody happy and comfortable. And it's not about you and your sound. There's a great story of an engineer working with a major artist where they had been working on a track all day long, and they were having trouble getting it. And they finally figured out what it was going to take. And they took a break, take a 10, and then we'll nail it in one take. And they took their 10, and everyone's going, oh boy, it was rough, but we got it now. It's going to be great. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. They go in, they sit down, tuned up the acoustic guitar, the artist, and said, okay, boys, now what was the tempo? And the drummer shows him the tempo. And it's a 1, 2, 1, 2, and over the talkback comes, just go around the toms one more time. And the artist threw his guitar on the ground and walked out. And it was just such a, that's an extreme example, but, come on, it's about, you couldn't have done that, before the 10 or before they all got situated and they're counting it off and the whole thing. It's like ridiculous. But yeah, you're there to help and not get in the way. I remember early on, I mixed an album, Carly Simon's No Secrets album. It was recorded by Robin Jeffrey Cable in England. Very good early English engineer that worked on Elton John albums and such. And Carly told me when I was mixing it that Robin said, what do you think of saying Carly Simon records Robin Jeffrey Cable's sound? Something like that. And, she kind of looked at him kind of funny, but he and some of the other engineers, they developed a sound, and that was the sound. And it didn't matter. I remember another very famous English engineer that shall remain nameless that had his sound, and it didn't, and it hit. And I remember he did a jazz record, and it was all that same kind of Trident Studios, close mic'd, lots of EQ sound, and it on a jazz record. And it was just like, completely foreign to me, at least. It just wasn't open and breathing. Yeah. So music, you're there to serve the music. And of course, I say that, I would say this in earlier times, and it's a very different thing now. If a lot of your audience are probably recording, like you said, one instrument at a time kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you big props on the jazz comment, because those Miles Davis records to me, they represent a big departure from the bebop in an open room kind of sound that maybe I might have, just been talking about that Tom Dowd recorded, but yet they retain that openness, and you created a whole new thing, but kept the respect for the jazz performance, and just like, it's like an acknowledgement of here's a whole new color palette.
Yeah.
And we'll play within that. It was very cool. Do you feel like the time you spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen, I appreciate you listening to this podcast, and I know you're trying to make your best record ever. But when you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then you're ready for UltimateMixingMasterclass.com. Tell us the story about working with Huey Lewis and the News. What do you want to say about those guys?
It's a long story.
All right. Well, we got time.
Okay. So I produced a band called Pablo Cruise back in the 70s. Had a few hits. Kind of sad because that band ultimately ended up looking like a lot of the, they call it yacht rock now.
I'm so glad you said that.
They call it yacht rock, but they could have been a force. I really believe it, because I produced their third album. They hadn't had a hit. They asked me to produce the second album. I may as well tell stories. They asked me to produce the second album. So they were coming to LA. A&M called me and said, would you want to meet with them? I said, sure. I went to a rehearsal studio. All rehearsal studios look the same. They have a stage at one end and couch and coffee tables and stuff on the other end. And I'm sitting at the coffee table. They went up, they played what they played. They didn't play one song. They played some grooves. And they came back to the couch, and we're sitting there, and I had my legs up on the coffee table, and we chatted for a little bit. And then the bass player said, well, we heard you're kind of crazy, but you seem normal to us. And with that, I took my leg and just swept off all the Cokes and potato chips, and everything went flying, and got up and walked out. And I was a little crazy. You have
to establish your legend.
I was a little crazy in my youth. And I called the manager and said, they're not ready to record, but I'll come up and work with them on the songs. And he said, no, they want to be in the studio in a month. And so that was the end of my relationship with them, until they went in with someone else and made the second record. And then a year later, they sent me 3 songs on a tape. And the first one was What You Gonna Do, which I knew was a hit. And I said, I'll be right up. Anyway,
wow.
So a few years later, their manager called me and said, I want you to come up and hear a band and tell me I'm crazy. So I went up. And I went to Uncle Charlie's up in Marin County, and saw Huey Lewis and American Express. And so I heard them and went back and talked to him afterwards, and went back to the hotel, and we came home. Manager called me and said, what do you think? I said, the band is good. The band is good. The songs need work, but that kid is a star. And there was no question. So from there, I took him in the studio, and we did some demos of the stuff. And Bob took them around and got turned down by every record company in LA, until finally Terry Ellis of Chrysalis came up to Uncle Charlie's and saw what I saw. And he wanted them. And so they signed with Chrysalis. And we decided to do the album in Los Angeles, and we rented a house in Laurel Canyon, which is a big thing these days. There's a lot of talk about Laurel Canyon, including a 2-part series now that's out and whatnot.
Still got the same little country store at the bottom of the hill to go get your lunch sandwiches.
Yep. And it's so funny. I wrote in the book just a little, because Laurel Canyon was an amazing breeding ground in the 60s into the 70s. And of course, Huey and the guys knew all about it. And this was a bit later than that, but we decided.
That's sort of like where Jim Morrison was just camped out right there. Right?
Yeah.
All that.
But the great documentary for people that don't know about, how all these guys worked together to write songs and stuff with Joni Mitchell and Linda Ronstadt and whatever. Anyway, we rented them a house in Laurel Canyon rather than those kind of live-in hotel kind of places to do the record. And he wanted, Huey at the time, he had made records before. He was in a band called Clover that Mutt Lange produced, and they made a couple of records in England. And Bob came to me before we started, and he said, Huey has some good amount of experience, and he has a lot of ideas.
Oh boy, does he have ideas.
He has a lot of ideas about what it should be. So, Pablo Cruise, I kind of contained and controlled and drove. But he said, give him freedom. So I said, okay. And so that's fine. So in the course of talking about it, I happened to mention Richie Podler's studio where I had grown up and whatnot, and where I heard that aha moment. And even though now this was 13 or 14 years later, and the studio hadn't changed a bit, but technology and a lot of things had. But Huey walked into the place and flipped out because it was so old school and everything, and wanted to do it there. And I knew I wasn't going to be able to get as modern a sound as I wanted to out of the place now, but he wanted it so bad. Okay. And he had this whole new wave. The band was very new wave at that time, the new wave of 79, eighth notes on the bass on all these songs and whatever. But
tempo, high energy,
yeah.
songs.
And so we did the album there. And so as we're doing overdubs, I called the manager and I said, I don't think we have any hits. And he said, really? What about this? I said, yeah, that's the best song, but I don't think it's a hit. He said, well, finish it up and whatever else you think, could possibly stand a chance. So I finished up, got the overdubs and did rough mixes on the 3 that I thought were the best, gave them to him. Manager goes to Chrysalis, comes back and says, they think you're great. They think it's wonderful. This is a hit. That's a hit. And if we get lucky, that ballad could go. Okay. So we finished it up and had a playback party at the house in Laurel Canyon. And we invited some friends, which included some of the Doobie Brothers over. And we're having this marvelous playback party time, which, playback parties, for those of you that never have had the marvelous opportunity to go, it's a lot of backslapping, that's for sure.
Right.
Aren't we all great kind of thing. And the head of A&R comes up to me and says, well, Bill, what do you think? And I said, I'll tell you what I think. I don't think there's any hits on this record. And he looked at me like I was drunk, and I don't drink. And he said, no, I think we're fine, and walked away. Well, the album came out, and guess what? There were no hits on the record. And so, what can I tell you? At this point, I'm building my studio, and I got a call from Huey, and he was really down. I said, what's wrong? Because he and I had hit it off like amazingly well. I just knew we were going to be making records till we were old and gray. And he said, the head of A&R just called and said, we have to get another producer because there were no hits on the record. Hell hath no fury, like Bill Schnee when he hears that. And I couldn't believe what I heard. And I said, Huey? And he said, and I never told Huey. In fact, if he listens to this podcast, it'll be the first time he learns of this, or if he reads my book.
That's great.
He's given me a beautiful endorsement on me, not the book. He hasn't read it yet, but on me. But he will learn it for the first time that and of course it's whatever. So I told him, I remember on a subsequent phone call, I said, Huey, this is a rotten business at some level, but you are going to make it. And I'm going to be right there, whether I'm producing you or not. You're
That's
just
great.
going to have to put one foot in front of the other and go. And the next time I saw him was about 2 months later, 3 months. he showed up with a couple of members of the band at my work at the construction zone that was to be the studio, and he said, we just went in the studio with someone they insisted on and trying, and if they think this is what we should sound like, I quit. I'm not going to do it. So he he told them that, and I don't know how, but the manager somehow got Chrysalis to let him go in and produce himself, which of course is an ultimate, really a bad slap in my face, because I'm the only one that said there weren't any hits. And now I held the record back. No, I don't think so. I was the only one that said there weren't any hits. So I have forgiven the manager for that, but it was really pretty bad on his part, I must say.
Yeah.
So anyway, so they went in and did the next record, and there were no hits. But of course they caught it now. Chrysalis wasn't going to let it happen. So he called his old buddy Mutt Lange and said, do you have a song that we could do? And he gave him Do You Believe in Love? And it had a different title. Huey changed the title, but that was the song. And that was it. And now, even then on the second record, because I had said to Bob, the songwriting needs work. And I knew that it wasn't going to happen. He wasn't going to let me change it on the first record. And I knew by the second record, I could start to relax them into something more acceptable. But they managed to do it on their own a little bit. But that third record, called Sports, through the roof, and the songwriting hit, and it was a piece of history. I told this story for 10 years. And at the end, every time I said, but I wouldn't be surprised if we don't work together again someday. Sure enough, they did another record, 4, and then they did another record, and it was a jazzy kind of record, and some of their audience went, what? What's this? And so they realized they had to reel it in. They started on the next record, and things weren't going very well, and the manager called me and said, would you want to come up and talk to him? And sure. And I came up, and he played me a work in progress of a song they were working on called Couple Days Off. And I knew it was a hit. And I said, yeah, let's do it again. And we went back in and did it. And then after that, we did that record. And there's a funny story there. Maybe, I don't know how long we're going to be here, but I got a lot of stories. That's why I wrote a book.
We like your stories.
Yeah, and then Huey decided to do a solo record, and I produced that. And it was nothing wrong with the band. He just, I never said it was Huey Lewis and American Express, and that they did. When they signed him, when Chrysalis signed him, I said, you got to change the name or we're going to get sued.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
You're going to get sued. So that's when they became the News. So anyway, we did
I think it's got a better ring than the American Express anyway.
So we did the solo record. Like I said, there was no problem with the band. He just wanted to try something else. And so we did it with some, really great musicians. And I put him with a songwriter that I had a lot of experience with. They wrote a lot of fun songs. And unfortunately, then I don't even think I mixed it for real. The typical kinds of problems. This is when the record business, where the wheels were starting to come off the cart a little bit. Right. And they dropped Huey, and that record never got released. It's one of a lot of them that end up in
those records, Huey Lewis and the News, I was growing up in the 80s, and that sound that you guys were making, that's the sound that I was growing up under. That was certainly, an iconic sound of that time, and important music, important records. When you talk about, I didn't hear any hits. We need to work on the songs. What advice do you have for us about how do you work on the songs? How do you find the right songs? How do you help an artist write better songs? What are some, maybe it's a really obvious answer, but we would appreciate it.
Well, I don't know if it's obvious, because there are so many things about this business are the gifts and talents that you have or don't have. I worked with a producer in the 70s who was the top producer in the 70s, Richard Perry, did a lot of his records. Ringo, where we worked with all the Beatles, Carly Simon. I did all the Pointer Sisters records. He produced all of these. Art Garfunkel's fabulous album, one of my favorite albums, Breakaway by Art Garfunkel. And Richard was phenomenal with matching songs to artists. And, I don't think you can learn that. There's certain things, you can't learn. I mean, you either have it or you don't. And I think one of the pieces of advice I always used to talk about with young people is the main, and of course I say used to because it doesn't apply anymore, because so much today, everybody is forced to do everything. They are the A&R department. If they're not the artist, if they're working with another artist, they are the A&R department. They are the engineer. You're doing everything. So, but the idea, I think, in music, because I always saw that a lot of people in music always wanted to do something else. The joke in the movie industry is, yeah, but I want to direct. Yeah, but you're a great actor. Yeah, but I want to direct. And some actors turn out to be pretty good directors for sure. But obviously, all of the best directors, however you want to look at it, are from an artistic or a monetary standpoint of what they accomplish, aren't actors. But and I saw this in music so much of the time, where people in certain areas of the record business wanted to produce records, but they really weren't good producers. I worked with some of those in the beginning of my career where I did the work for them. But so, like I said, the idea is to try to do what you're really best suited for. But in today's economy, like I said, everyone is forced to do everything. But maybe you can kind of figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are and get someone that's, that's better at things that you're weak at to augment it.
Yeah, I feel like as you learn to embrace and welcome collaboration, you can appreciate that things can be done really well when you have a group of people and everybody's focusing on doing some aspect of it really well.
Amen. And that's one of the things that, of course, is missing so much, and why I'm so grateful that I'm still able to here in Nashville, where people will go in a room together and record. That ultimately, that's why I sold my studio and decided to move here, was because there's just so little of that being done in LA with for whatever reason or reasons. And that camaraderie of creative people putting their talents together is a wonderful thing. So I think some of the great things that I hear about today are young bands where there's maybe one guy that is pretty good with the technical stuff, and another guy that's a little better with the songwriting or whatever, and they're pooling themselves together and coming up with some great stuff. That's wonderful.
And hopefully one of them's really good at social media.
Yeah.
So you fairly recently moved to Nashville, I think you were saying.
Just under 2 years, yeah.
But you've been here and done records with Randy Travis, Kenny Rogers, all kinds of people, right?
Yeah.
What was one of your first visits to Nashville to make a record?
Oh boy.
Were there any stories or memories around being, struck by Nashville at that point?
The biggest story of struck by Nashville was how terrible the Italian food was. I don't know what to tell you. I always said, Chef Boyardee has nothing to worry about. A can of those SpaghettiOs will do just fine. Yeah, it was a joke.
Is L.A. known for great Italian food?
New York is what was known for great Italian food. Yeah. In fact, a phenomenal story about that, if you like stories, is so one of my very good friends and a phenomenally talented, one of the favorite people in the music business is Bob Gaudio. He was the songwriter and not main singer in the Four Seasons. And he moved here, I don't know exactly, 20 years ago, let's say, 20-something years ago. And my next trip to LA, he'd been here like 3 years or something. And so I called him up and I said, let's have lunch. He said, absolutely. So we're at the restaurant. He was there first. I'm looking around. I see him. I go up to him. He gets up to give me a hug. He gives me a hug. And I said, Bob, before you sit down, I have to ask you, where does Bob Gaudio, who's a New York, actually New Jersey Italian who loves Italian food, where does Bob Gaudio go for Italian food? And he looks at me like I'm crazy and he goes, New York. Judy and I get on a plane on Saturday morning. Oh, that makes sense. Anyway, yeah. But early recollections of that, I wish if I could remember what I did. I had met in LA I had met a producer from here, the guy that produced almost all the Randy Travis records, Kyle Lenning. I had met him in Los Angeles.
Kyle's great. He's been on the podcast as well.
Yeah. He's one of my best friends. He was in my wedding and in fact, when I told him that Sally and I were moving here, he said, "You don't need to move here. Take my downstairs." He's got a bedroom where I always stayed. He said, "Just move here.
That's great.
Live here." I had met him and so I know I stayed with him. I know I stayed at his house when he was living in Hendersonville, but I can't remember what the first thing was. But I always... I didn't appreciate the music community from afar. Like, it seemed like it was coming this is the end of the 70s when I first came here. And it was still, you still had a mix of the old crew, with the newer guys that were coming in the session scene here and stuff. But it seemed like it was a pretty close-knit family. And did they really want outsiders? That kind of thing, especially as far as musicians go, I think. I don't know. But I mean, everybody, because I came here, all I ever did here was mix until Kyle ended up running a record company for a while. And I told him when it was about, I don't know, 2 or 3 years into it, I called him one day and said, if this record company goes down the drain and you haven't found something for me to produce, I don't know if I can talk to you. And not too long after that, he called and said, "I think I got something for you." And so I flew out, and there was a show at the Ryman on Patsy Cline, and the singer was a girl named Mandy Barnett. And I heard a singer and a voice that just blew me away. And so we hit it off great, and I did her first record with Kyle. And she, in the book, I put I have some superlatives, the best this, the best that. They're just kind of winks at different things. And in there I put singer not enough people know about, Mandy Barnett, one of the best singers I've ever put a microphone in front of. And that's true to this day. In fact, what's amazing is I came here and I've done 2 records with her since I got here. Neither one of them is out. One of them is a country record that I mixed. The other one is an astounding record that is with a 55-piece orchestra live. It's the songs from the last Billie Holiday album. It's a Torch album, and it's arranged by Sammy Nestico, who is 92 years old and did an astounding job. And that's just an absolutely gorgeous record. Anyway.
Wow. I love hearing those stories. I mean, Kyle's great. He's been, like I said, he's been on as well as a couple of his sons, Jason and Jordan, both on the show too. Very cool family.
Yeah.
In fact, there was one day I did a session with Jason, and I took a photo of Kyle's dad and Jason, so 3 generations of the Lennings just standing right in front of the studio. It was pretty cool. And I love those moments, and I love that whole part of what we do. I love the history of recording and making these records and the stories and the way it all connects together. And the deeper you go, the more connected you see it all,
Well, the one thing, remind me to talk about sons. The one thing that, I've always thought, and it's not the main impetus for me writing the book, but I think it, in so many disciplines, you are forced to study where you came from, what went on, to know where you are. And especially, to carry the mantra into the next, time period. And not enough of that, in a lot of cases, not anywhere near enough of that is done, about studying. So that's why I kind of think someone has suggested to me that I Reed Shippen. Have you had him on?
Yeah, F. Reed Shippen was a classmate of mine at MTSU. He's been on as well. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, because he told me you must have the same guy. He told me he said that my book should be a textbook. He said he's going to talk to him about it. And at first I thought, a textbook? It's stories and stuff. But the more I think about it, it goes right in with what I'm saying right now. I think it's good to hear about how things were and whatnot, because you can learn a lot from that. about how you got where you are. You are here today, and you're going to go into tomorrow. But
it's important to hear the stories to understand that people are people. People making records yesterday were people like you're making records today, and we're dealing with a lot of the same basic life stuff.
Yeah, Mark Rubel, who runs the Blackbird Academy, part of his training for them, it's a pretty short program, but part of the training for that is he takes them to Memphis, he takes them to Muscle Shoals. He's going to show them, not, he's able, because of proximity here, he's able to actually, and around town, he takes them, to RCA and wherever, different places, and to show them. And that's what we're talking about, that whole thing of seeing where you came from.
Yeah. Well, I think it's true. I think when you start out too, I think that, I remember being fascinated by anything that had history to it. I was eating it up, going to some studio, and then you hear stories about things that were done, or you meet somebody who'd made records and would tell you about how it was done. Even if it was 10 years ago, it felt like legends, and so I think that's what motivates us to get started. It's important.
Oh, I wanted to back up 1 second. I should say that Kyle, when he was running the record company, he called me and said, come out here. I want you to hear someone. And we went in and heard Ben Folds. And I got with him. And of course, he's not country. He wasn't about to be country.
Right.
But
Was this in the 90s?
What's before he popped. He was a young kid.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that time. I moved here in 91. He was one of the first artists I saw. And it was a thing called, what was it called? Jody's Power Bill was the name of his band back then.
That's it.
Yeah, that's
right. And so he came to the office the next day. We heard it said. He came to the office the next day, and we talked about it and everything. And I thought, this is someone worth recording. And Kyle told it to his parent company, and they passed on him. Anyway, I just thought I'd bring that up. But back to sons. The great thing about what's so cool is Kyle having two of his sons in the business, doing it. Where he actually, in fact, Jason, came out to LA and hung out for, I don't remember how long, a couple of weeks in my studio.
That's cool.
And, but I'm fortunate that one of my sons is kind of in music. He's doing music for film. And funny enough, the same guy that Joel that told Clive Davis about me, that got so that I didn't have to go back to law school and gave me my break. About 8-9 years ago, I hadn't seen Joel in a while. We got together, and my son Oliver was just graduating USC, and I told him he asked about what the kids are doing. And I told him where Oliver was at, and I said, and I really think he's got it, putting the eyes with the ears. And in fact, I put him with James Newton Howard, who I mentioned earlier, who has since become a major, like I said, one of the top film composers in the world. And Oliver ended up interning with him for 2.5 years. And now Joel has taken Oliver under his wing and has gotten him all kinds of great gigs and stuff. And
well, that's pretty cool, And when I moved here, I came from a family where I was, me choosing to do this was a little bit like you describing it. I was sort of the black sheep choice. I was like, I had to convince my dad that it was okay because I went to architecture school. And then I was like, well, I'm going to study recording so that I can become an architectural designer of recording studios. And he was like, all right, I'm cool with that. This is the only studio I ever designed was my own, But, it's that. And then I'd come here and I'd meet people like Jason and, people who grew up in musical families. And I was always struck by that, and wondered like how powerful that is if you grow up around it and everything like that. So I think it's cool. It's awesome.
Well, one of my mantras has been about so many things. It's not how you get there. It's that you get there.
Yeah.
Whatever the there is.
Yeah. Yeah. Stick to it. Well, Bill, we've been going for an awesome long stretch and really appreciate having you on the show. Really great. Is there anything we didn't talk about yet that we forgot to?
Tons.
But
I wouldn't know what.
All right. Well, maybe we'll come back and do another 3 hours sometime.
Sure.
But very exciting that your book's coming up. We can't wait to read that. Rockstars, again, a reminder, the link will be in the show notes. Chairman at the Board. What was the second half of the title? Was
Recording the Soundtrack of a Generation.
There you go. So really looking forward to reading that and hearing all these deeper stories of everything. Where should everybody go if they want to learn more about you, or is there a website or anything you want them to go to?
BillSchnee.com has just been put up. I find myself, I've never been into self-promotion. When I got in the business, as Richie Podler told me, you do good work, you'll get another job. And Clive told me when I went to work for him, he said, this is a business of what have you done lately? Not even what have you done, but what have you done lately?
Right.
And all that. And so, but I'm kind of a shy person by nature. And not a self-promoter, unfortunately, because it's to my detriment to a degree. But now with the book coming out, I've been forced to do this. So somebody that worked for me had told me, you should, 20 years ago, you should be branding yourself. And I don't know how to do that. So with what's going on, one of the cute things about that happened is when the book ended up being way too long. So in editing, they cut out over a third of it. And it's still 100,000 words, whatever that's going to translate to, 370 pages or something. It's still going to be a long book. But
it's like the gold record of word counts.
But what someone suggested was that you get a website and in the book, give them a key, which would be a phrase, and send them to the website to open it up. And they can read everything else that you wrote. So that's what we've done. I got with the company to put the website, and I got chairman@theboard.com, but he said, you should, same thing my friend told me 20 years ago, you should be branding yourself. So I took BillSchnee.com 20 years ago. So that's what we used instead. And what's cool about it is now that I've done it is that it shows we have a tab called What's New. And right now, just launched a website a couple of weeks ago. And what's cool is there's 5 things on there, and they're all so new because of COVID that none of them are out yet. But there's definitely some cool things on there. I'm very excited about the future here.
So Rockstars, once again, we're recording this during quarantine times, and you'll be hearing it later. And hopefully we'll be looking back on that and going, oh, remember those silly times we had to go through?
Sure hope we're looking back on them.
Sure hope so. Well, Bill, thank you so much for being here. Rockstars, again, go to BillSchnee.com and you can find out more about what's going on and get links to the book, or just go in the show notes right here in this episode and click through. And Bill, it's an honor, man.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for being here with us.
You've been great.
You've been even greater. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who help make this episode possible. OWC, Presonus, API Audio, Isotope, Soundporter Mastering, Jay-Z Microphones, and Spectra 1964. You will find links to all these wonderful sponsors in our show notes. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio, and they're going to help you make your best record ever. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.